The committee will come to order without objection. The chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled Examining the Export-Import Bank's Reauthorization Request and the Government's Role in Export Financing. This is our third hearing on EXIM this Congress, our fifth in the last 24 months, so for better or for worse, rarely has such a small agency received so much attention by our committee. I now recognize myself for 3 minutes to give an opening statement. I begin my comments by admitting that Republicans on my side of the aisle are split on the issue of EXIM reauthorization. I certainly respect the arguments of those who support H.R. 597, and I look forward to continuing our principled debate. I do understand that one person's corporate welfare and politically driven capital allocation is another person's vital export support program and level playing field. However, understanding my Democrat colleagues' arguments is proving to be more challenging. They claim EXIM is essential to supporting jobs, but I would ask most of my Democratic friends, where was your concern for jobs when you voted for Obamacare, which according to the Congressional Budget Office is going to lead to 2.5 million fewer jobs in our economy? Where was your concern for jobs when your party voted against the Keystone Pipeline and the 42,000 jobs the State Department says are connected to it? Where was your concern for 45,000 jobs when most of your caucus voted against legislation to advance construction of LNG export products? Democrats claim EXIM is essential to U.S. trade, but almost 99% of all U.S. exports are financed without EXIM. My Democratic friends are so concerned about trade. Why are so many of them opposing Trade Promotion Authority? No less a Democrat than President Obama himself says that TPA will create more jobs and expand economic opportunities for middle-income Americans. The National Association of Manufacturers reports that over half of the structural cost disadvantage suffered by American exporters comes from our corporate tax system. Yet few, if any, Democrats support a fairer, flatter tax system, much less reducing our corporate tax rate, the highest in the industrialized world. Now, how many times have we heard Democrats vilify Wall Street banks? Yet the big banks profit off EXIM like few others. The latest data I've seen shows J.P. Morgan Chase received $5.1 billion in assistance, Citigroup $1.5 billion, Wells Fargo $500 million, and HSBC almost $1 billion. They all profit from EXIM, and as far as I can see, they all vigorously support its reauthorization. After all, they have hard-working taxpayers to bail out any Wall Street losses. As one Citigroup managing director recently said, there's nothing that a commercial bank loves more than guaranteed financing, quote unquote. Another Wall Street banker was quoted in the press saying EXIM guarantees are, quote, free money, unquote, for the big banks. By reauthorizing EXIM, my Democratic colleagues are simply throwing Wall Street a big, wet kiss. Just 6 weeks ago, the ranking member asked the question, quote, why is it that the richest of the folks in the businesses in this country who have so many paid lobbyists are able to direct the public policy in ways the average citizen cannot do? Boeing, which receives fully 1/3 of EXIM's support, spent $35 million in lobbying expenses in the last Congress to help keep EXIM afloat. Their top 5 executives made $48.6 million in 2013 alone. The public reports from other top beneficiaries of EXIM, like GE, Caterpillar, ExxonMobil, they all look pretty similar. So I would say to my friend, the ranking member, perhaps their paid lobbying is so successful and their executives are getting so rich because you're doing everything you can to help them. To support a more robust economic growth and economic justice, not to mention equal opportunity for all, it's time to wind down EXIM. I now recognize the ranking member for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's the 11th hour for the Export-Import Bank. Only 14 legislative days remain until this engine of economic growth shuts down. For 2 years, Democrats on this committee and many Republicans have asked the chairman to listen to reason with respect to the Export-Import Bank's reauthorization. We have pushed for action in this committee because for the thousands of American jobs and businesses across every one of our states and districts that count on EXIM support, the stakes are high. With 190 Democrats on record in support of a multi-year extension of the bank's charter and 59 Republicans on a separate reauthorization measure, including 5 on this very committee, the facts are unequivocal. A majority of the members of the Financial Services Committee and of the House of Representatives support keeping the Export-Import Bank up and running for the long term. In light of the staunch opposition from this chairman, I'd like to take a minute to thank Representative Stephen Fincher for having the courage to stand up for what he believes is right by offering legislation that commits to a long-term reauthorization of the bank. Unfortunately, despite the fact that the bank faces closure in just 14 legislative days, these 2 bills to reauthorize its charter are gathering dust in the chairman's office. Mr. Chairman, while you continue playing games with the Export-Import Bank, today we will do our best to remind you of the real people who will be impacted by shutting it down. Later in this hearing, you will hear from Michael Boyle, Chief Executive Officer of Boyle Energy Services and Technology. Mr. Boyle is a Republican, and his energy firm is located Manchester, New Hampshire, right in the district of Representative Ginta. He's going to tell this committee about how the Export-Import Bank took his business of 8 employees and helped it expand to 60 presently. For some reason, that engine of economic growth, which allowed Mr. Boyle to grow and expand his business, is the latest ideological target of this committee. Mr. Chairman, we're not legislating in a vacuum. Closing the Export-Import Bank will have real consequences for businesses trying to survive in an increasingly competitive marketplace. I'm disappointed this game continues, and I yield back my time.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizenga, Chairman of the Monetary Policy and Trade Subcommittee, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding this hearing to further examine Export-Import's reauthorization request. And as I've stated before, I'm dismayed that some of the best American companies believe that they need special programs and carve-outs like XM to remain competitive on the global stage, as opposed to dealing with what I believe are the true hurdles, tax reform as well as regulatory reform. If we allow a select few companies to determine the outcome of the EXIM Bank, what happens when we do try to work out the reform of our tax code? What happens when we actually try to close loopholes? How can we address social entitlement programs if Congress is unwilling to address corporate entitlement programs as well? In 2012, although I voted no, Congress reauthorized EXIM while mandating several modest reform provisions that shared broad bipartisan support. These reforms were viewed as vital. I voted no because I was concerned that the bill was actually nothing more than window dressing. Although these reforms were intended to better protect taxpayers and make the Export-Import Bank more accountable, the bank and Treasury continue to ignore congressional intent and instead operate with too little accountability with regard to the interests of hardworking American taxpayers. It looks like, unfortunately, I was right in 2012. American taxpayers have been unwittingly propping up foreign state-owned companies in Saudi Arabia, Russia, Colombia, Ethiopia, South Africa, etc., while others have done nothing but work against the best interests of American taxpayers. Additionally, the Export-Import Bank has an unsavory track record involving corruption, bribery, and fraud. The Acting Inspector General of the Export-Import Bank testified in our joint hearings with the Oversight and Government Reform that 47 people have been convicted of defrauding the bank in the past 5 years, and that there are at least 31 open investigations with the potential for even more indictments. The more that is unearthed about the Export-Import Bank, the more concerned I become. While the goal and objective of the bank may be admirable, the current state of the bank is abhorrent at best. Why should Congress spend taxpayer dollars on an organization that has reestablished a track record of corruption? Why should American tax dollars be used to finance foreign government-owned or operated companies that compete against American workers? Why should the hardworking taxpayers take on unnecessary risk when private companies refuse to do so? Unfortunately, for the folks at XM, I've come to the conclusion that the Export-Import Bank is beyond broken and that it's time for the bank's charter to expire.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore, ranking member of the Monetary Policy and Trade Subcommittee, for 1 minute.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. This is an important hearing, as the Export-Import Bank charters expires at the end of this month. After several of these hearings, what do we know? In 2012, a number of substantive reforms were made by Congress, and the bank has implemented an overwhelming number of them. We know that private finance supports the bank, cannot fill the void, and that the bank is not crowding out private capital, and it's a straw man, fallacious argument about it being corporate welfare designed to undermine the social safety net for people. We know that the bank operates with a low default rate, with meaningful and vigorous oversight by the IG. We know the bank supports good jobs and small businesses in the United States of America. The counterpoint we'll hear today from some libertarian academics is the claim that the bank somehow creates hidden costs for some companies. But I think the best evidence against this case are trying to make that several firms mentioned in the research as being hurt by the bank, such as Newcar and AK Steel, actually support the bank. I yield back.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Heck, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We should be skeptical of government lending programs because private markets are generally better at allocating credit, and it's easy, maybe even reasonable, to become cynical about our political process. If a company comes to me and says they're hurt by EXIM, I worry for their employees. But we owe this topic more than a gut-level skepticism and easy cynicism. Our job as members of Congress is to get information on how the world actually works and base our policy on that. Stephen Fincher has set the example. He came to Congress as a skeptic of EXIM, asked questions, voted no initially, replaced that skepticism with facts, and came to see the critical need for the bank. Today is an opportunity for all of us to do that. Afraid that the EXIM is undercutting private banks? Ask Mr. Murphy whether the banks see it that way. Cynical that EXIM only helps big companies like Boeing? Go to EXIM and see who gets support in your district. Skeptical that there's really a need for government to be making these loans? Ask Mr. Boyle about the alternatives for small business. Frankly, there are none. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Today we welcome the testimony of the Honorable Fred Hochberg, the Chairman and President of the Export-Import Bank, and Mr. Michael McCarthy, the Deputy Inspector General of the EXIM Bank. Each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral summary of your testimony. Without objection, each of your written statements will be made part of the record. Chairman Hochberg, you are now recognized for your testimony.
Thank you. Chairman, Ranking Member, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me today to testify before you about how EXIM equips small businesses, U.S. businesses, to compete in the global economy and add jobs here at home. EXIM complements and works with the private sector. We provide private sector backstop financing so American entrepreneurs can seize global opportunities, create jobs, and not get left behind by their foreign rivals. And we have been successful, supporting 164,000 jobs last year alone. EXIM does not pick winners and losers. Rather, it serves any eligible American business seeking competitive financing to export. We are, by definition, demand-driven. Of course, our customers pay fees and interest for this service, and as a result, EXIM is completely self-sustaining. Last year alone, EXIM generated $675 million for the taxpayers for deficit reduction. If EXIM Bank is not reauthorized, we no longer generate $500 million for the taxpayer. On top of that, we are keenly focused on risk management, demonstrated by our low default rate of 0.167% as of March 2015. And as you know, in 2012, EXIM was reauthorized by overwhelming bipartisan support. And today, 250 House members have co-sponsored legislation aimed at giving EXIM a long-term reauthorization. I take seriously my duty to implement the will of Congress. That's why I have provided each of you with all the documentation outlining EXIM's implementation of every single requirement from the 2012 reauthorization, and why I will work diligently to implement any future requirements that Congress chooses to act. In addition, EXIM continuously acts to proactively implement risk management improvements to further ensure that we remain faithful stewards of taxpayer dollars. To name just two, we increased our staffing and asset monitoring by 33%, and we went beyond all federal requirements and require mandatory ethics trainings of every single employee. Of course, any organization can experience a bad apple. And let me underscore, EXIM has zero tolerance for fraud, waste, and abuse, and works closely with the IG to take thorough and immediate action when any hint of misconduct is detected. In the last 6 years, there has been exactly one indictment involving an EXIM employee, a situation that was uncovered thanks to a tip from a fellow employee. This infraction goes back to 2006 during the Bush administration before EXIM had an Inspector General. Unfortunately, there are always those outside of the agency who will try and defraud the government. EXIM has 31 such cases. The Social Security Administration had over 16,000 in the last 2 years, and DOD had more than 6,000 last year alone. The point is, there will always be outsiders who attempt to defraud the government. But frankly, thanks to our focus on fraud detection and risk management, EXIM has a track record of successfully protecting the public trust. Meanwhile, global competition has ramped up, and since our last reauthorization, it will continue to. American businesses and workers aren't simply competing against their Chinese, Russian, and French counterparts. Often they're competing against countries. However, Congress has made it clear they've asked the Treasury Secretary to ratchet down export credits. And while that's the Secretary's responsibility, as I said, I take the will of Congress seriously. As a result, I recently met with many of my foreign counterparts to discuss exactly that topic. And here's what I heard. To the contrary, our counterparts intend to accelerate financial backing for exports. Their role is clear. When commercial banks constrict financing, export credit agencies fill the gap so that domestic exporters don't lose sales or jobs. EXIM Bank is like a fire truck in that sense. You don't sell off the fire truck just because there's a fire currently burning. In closing, as this committee is aware, businesses need certainty to make long-term plans to grow, hire, and innovate. There are now about 80 other export credit agencies around the world fighting for jobs. And unlike EXIM Bank, one of China's export credit agencies recently noted they doubled their activity in 2014 and expect to double it again in the next year or two. We look forward to working with you to continue empowering your constituents to export more and hire more American workers. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Chairman Hochberg. Mr. McCarthy, you're now recognized for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Waters, and members of the committee. I am pleased to be here to present the work of the Export-Import Bank Office of Inspector General. The committee has my written testimony, which highlights the work that our professional auditors, inspectors, and special agents have done to promote efficiency and detect and deter fraud at EXIM Bank. The committee has asked me to discuss investigations into fraud at the bank, recent court activity, and recommendations to improve risk management and prevent misconduct. Let me briefly cover a few highlights. Since 2009, OIG investigations into fraud schemes that target EXIM Bank have yielded 84 criminal indictments and informations, 50 convictions, and $255 million in judgments and repayments. The most common fraud schemes we have encountered involve outside parties obtaining loans or guarantees through false representations and submission of false documents. We work closely with the bank's asset management division, who make referrals of transactions or claims with indicators of fraud. We currently have 30 open investigations, and nearly all of them address outside persons committing fraud against the bank and have no indications of EXIM employee involvement. However, one of those fraud cases involves former EXIM loan officer Johnny Gutierrez, who recently pleaded guilty to one count of bribery of a public official. Mr. Gutierrez admitted accepting more than $78,000 in bribes in return for recommending the approval of unqualified loan applications, among other misconduct. This case remains an active fraud investigation against other parties. We have closed other employee integrity cases in the past year that led to findings of misconduct and personnel being separated from employment at the bank, but not criminal charges. As I have previously testified, our open investigations are at various stages and, working with the Department of Justice, some cases may result in prosecutions for bank fraud and money laundering. At this time, I would not expect charges against any other Ex-Im Bank employees from our current caseload. As to our recommendations, we have 48 open and unresolved recommendations, 24 from the current fiscal year and 24 from prior fiscal years. The written testimony summarizes our most recent audit and inspection work. Our independent audit of the bank's financial statements found that they were fairly presented in all material respects and had no material weaknesses. Our audits also found substantial compliance with the cybersecurity requirements of FSMA and found that internal controls for the short-term multi-buyer insurance program provided reasonable assurance of compliance. Our inspection of transactions in Ghana found that one project was appropriately structured and was performing, while we identified engineering issues with another transaction and made recommendations for improvement going forward. Finally, a recent annual audit found noncompliance with the Improper Payments Act, and we recommended changes to the risk assessment process, which the bank is implementing. Every year, we review our work and identify the top management challenges facing the bank. Last fall, the OIG reported that the top challenge was managing risk, specifically managing the bank's core business activities to reduce the risk of loss to the Treasury and, by extension, the taxpayer. To manage that risk, we have recommended the bank design an agency-wide risk management framework so that, in addition to rating the risk of any individual transaction, the bank is also evaluating and mitigating the risks generated by the overall composition of the portfolio and any outsized exposures the bank has in certain regions, industry sectors, or single companies. To accomplish this, we have recommended a Chief Risk Officer, which the bank has established. The bank has also conducted stress testing and monitoring of exposure levels. We hope the bank will build on these steps by developing and implementing key risk policies covering both credit and non-credit risks. We have also recommended improvements to due diligence and know your customer policies, and the bank has deployed improvements in those areas. Finally, we previously found that internal policies providing clear guidance to staff had not been prevalent at Ex-Im Bank, so we recommended that the bank rely more on clear policies, controls, and documentation, and less on institutional knowledge. Many of our recommendations have been for specific internal control policies, which the bank is working on implementing. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. I'm happy to answer the members' questions.
Thank you. The Chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes of questions. Chairman Hochberg, last month the Richmond Federal Reserve updated a report called the Bailout Barometer. Is there any chance that this might have come across your desk?
No, it did not.
In this report, the Richmond Fed states that roughly 60% of all financial transactions in our economy are now either explicitly or implicitly backed by the federal government, up about a third since the financial crisis. In your testimony, you have a chart showing that taxpayer exposure has roughly doubled from $58 billion to $112 billion over this same time period. Is that correct?
Yes, that sounds right.
In the Bailout Barometer report, the Richmond Fed says, quote, "This protection could make financial crises and bailouts more likely." I would commend it to your reading at some time. Chairman Hochberg, in our last hearing, we spoke about Ex-Im financing different foreign state-owned enterprises. In fact, do you have a statistic of the financial assistance, how much of it goes to state-owned enterprises?
I couldn't give you a precise number. I think the difference, Mr. Chairman, is that, we have a capitalist society. We have far more private sector enterprises.
Okay, but you admit it includes a number of state-owned enterprises, like Pemex in Mexico, which I believe is one of the largest recipients, Air India in India, ICBC Leasing in China. We had a rather robust discussion about EXIM's support of China. I think there's currently, at the end of the last fiscal year, $4.5 billion in exposure to China, and I think the vast majority of that, according to your records, is to state-owned enterprises. Several members asked you about how to essentially ask the question, including myself, how are we supposed to compete with China by subsidizing China? And your reply was, sir, it's a complicated world out there. Let me try to ask simple questions then. In your opinion, do state-owned, EXIM-supported foreign airlines like Air China compete with American carriers and their employees?
Well, we deploy an economic impact review anytime we do a loan to any.
I understand that, sir. I'm just asking your opinion. Do you believe they compete or not?
Everybody's competing for airline passengers, yes.
Okay, so you believe that China Air is competing with American carriers. How about the EXIM-supported foreign refineries like Star Refinery in Turkey compete with American refiners?
Yes, it's a global world, sir.
Okay. In your testimony, you state more than once, and you said it in your oral testimony, that EXIM doesn't pick winners and losers. I don't know what's on your schedule for this afternoon. I would commend that you stick around for the second panel. Maybe you would change your mind, because when you finance a state-owned airline, you are making Boeing a winner and Delta a loser. You can hear Delta's testimony later on today. When you finance a Turkish refinery, you make Fluor a winner, you make Valero a loser. When you finance an Australian mining project, you make Caterpillar a winner, you make Cliffs Natural Resources a loser. You can hear their testimony later on today. And according to the Congressional Budget Office, if you were forced to use fair value accounting like the rest of America, you would be making the taxpayer a loser as well. So if you have the time, I would commend the second panel to your attention. You also brought up in your testimony, and you have it here, a report as an appendix to your testimony entitled, Every Reform Completed. But when we look at the reforms, the so-called reforms of the 2012 reauthorization, what I see in your report, I see the words plan, study, monitor, report, notice, comment, categorize, examine, and review. I know this was something that was authorized by Congress, but Chairman Hochberg, I think there are only two real reforms for most people in the 2012 reauthorization. One is Section 11 that mandated that Treasury initiate negotiations to substantially reduce with the ultimate goal of eliminating subsidized export financing. You stated this is completed annually by the U.S. Department of Treasury. Not only is it not completed, there is scant evidence it's ever been started. Section 12 requires the bank to develop and make publicly available methodological guidelines to be used for conducting economic analysis. I think you know, according to the Wall Street Journal, in conducting this analysis, you allegedly allowed your largest customer, Boeing, ultimate beneficiary, to write the rules. As the Wall Street Journal said itself, quote, an extraordinary level of cooperation. Also, according to the Wall Street Journal, quote, the collaboration appears to have worked. In the nearly 2 years since the rule went into effect, no Boeing sales have been nixed as a result. My point is, Chairman Hochberg, you might report, you might plan, you might study, but I'm not sure you actually managed to enforce the only reforms that counted in the reauthorization. I see I'm over my time. I now yield to the ranking member 5 minutes.
Mr. Hochberg, I thank you for coming over one more time to explain to my chairman and the members on the opposite side of the aisle what harm they are doing to the American economy and how they are disrespectful of and not recognizing the trade deficit that we have, and how the work that the bank is doing with 2% of our exports in dealing with our competitiveness issue. I thank you for all of that. But what I'd like you to do is to take China and 2 or 3 other countries that give such support to the export industry and talk about how they hope we will not reauthorize this bank, and what this means for their economy and what it means for our economy.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ranking Member. China alone is not a part of any OECD, any part of global framework. So one of the difficulties we have is they don't follow the rules, they're not transparent, they don't follow any guidelines, and they have said point blank they will do whatever it takes to further their exports and further their trade increase. China has up to 4 different export credit agencies that actually finance their exports, all government-sponsored, all government-backed, with not a lot of transparency and not a lot of accountability. One of them alone, Sinosure, which does insurance long-term and short-term, did about $670 billion in the last 2 years. It took Exim Bank 80 years to get to $590 billion, and they've done that in 2 years. They've also indicated they doubled and they plan to double again in the next 1 to 2 years. And Korea is also exceedingly aggressive, as is Japan and a number of others, particularly in Asia.
Also, I would like for you to give us some idea of what has been happening in this space where we have been debating whether or not we are going to do reauthorization, and how some have lost faith in our ability to help with our own exports, and how we're losing out already to other countries.
Well, you're going to have Mike Boyle, who's going to be on the second panel, who can speak directly to that. Additionally, a number of the banks that we work with to get working capital loans, overwhelmingly for small businesses, have simply pulled back while they're waiting to see what happens. They don't want to go out there and issue a working capital guarantee and then find the rug pulled out from under them in 14 legislative days from now. So we are finding a reduction in working capital applications. And on insurance, which is the bulk of what our small businesses use, there's also been a reluctance and a wait and see to make sure we're going to be there to really execute those policies.
Also, Mr. Hochberg, on this business about the private sector, who is stopping the private sector from investing for supporting exports? Who's stopping them? What barriers do they have for not exercising their right to finance and support any business that they want to support? What is this business about? We're somehow interfering with the private sector's ability to finance and support exports.
Well, you're absolutely right. The private sector does a spectacular job, a better job in our country than any other country. And it's the private sector that brings us in when they hit a barrier or a roadblock that they can't surmount. So it's the private sector tries to do it on their own, and when they can't is when they call us in for a guarantee to make sure a loan gets done.
When you refer to call us in, or when you have businesses who come to you and say, I can't get private sector funding, can you take a look at my business and see what you can do to help me, et cetera, et cetera? Who is it you're helping, aside from those that my chairman would have you believe all of the support is going to one company? Are you supporting small businesses, and why do they come to you?
Well, Ranking Member, I was a small business owner for 20 years, a family business. Small businesses always have difficulty getting access to credit. 90% of our clients are actually small businesses, direct small businesses, and 39% of the exports we finance are shipped directly from a small company. Then there's many, many small businesses in the supply chain of some of the larger companies we work with that are carried along in the process. But they come to us, their banks come to us saying, this is a risk we cannot take on. Maybe it's a country, maybe it's the size of the transaction, maybe it's the product category.
And so, does Mr. Henselin have any of these small businesses in Texas?
We have a lot in Texas. We actually have a couple right in his district as well.
Okay, so it is not that some in his district are not benefiting from it. All over the United States, we have these small businesses that are benefiting from EXIM, not just in California or some of the other states of these representatives. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizinga, chairman of our Monetary Policy and Trade Subcommittee. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm astounded just once again the shifting sands of political expediency are rearing their ugly head here today. And I wasn't necessarily going to go in this direction, but I feel it needs to be addressed. There was a call towards our trade deficits. I'm curious as to then why many of my colleagues who are in support of the Export-Import Bank oppose tax reform, oppose regulatory reform, and even oppose something called TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, and TTIP, an agreement with the Europeans, and the vehicle to get there, the TPA. I'm curious what kind of reaction that they have when we're able to read quotes such as this. I'm not a Democrat who believes that we can or should defend every government program just because it's there. The Export-Import Bank that has become little more than a fund for corporate welfare. But if we hope to meet the challenges of our time, we must make difficult choices, said President, then candidate Barack Obama. You'd probably be hard-pressed to guess who actually said these quotes as well. Most Americans do not understand that we put $1 billion into this Export-Import Bank. Many would see this as simply corporate welfare. Now, this is in 2002, so closely on the heels of when they actually did have to put money into the Export-Import Bank. By the way, it's interesting to note that the corruption and the fraud cases that are talked about are in the last 6 years. It does conveniently leave out the fact that we had one of our Democrat colleagues, William Jefferson, go down and spend, I believe it is 13 to 15 years in federal prison for bribery surrounding his actions in this bank. Another quote, unfortunately, the bank has a history of providing assistance to companies that have been exporting American jobs and hiring cheap foreign labor. And then this is just a good kicker. I urge my colleagues to oppose Senate Bill 1372, the Export-Import Bank Reauthorization Act of 2002. That's none other than our ranking member, Ms. Waters from California. So it seems to me the only thing that has really shifted and changed is that there's a different person in the White House at this point. I would argue that seeing what happened in 2009 and now most recently with the Gutierrez case, things have gotten worse, not better, in the bank itself. It does lead me to then go to something that I want to touch on, which is I think more evidence that we're beyond broken here with the Export-Import Bank. In 2012, there was some requirements for some of these checks and balances be putting in. Something that I'm sure is very familiar, NewSat to you. The due diligence standards and the Know Your Customer requirements were finalized in May 20 of 2014 after the NewSat deal was approved. And for those of you that haven't been following this, NewSat was a, I believe it was an Australian company. Is that correct, Mr. Hochberg?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, Australian company that at this point appears to be handing you a $100 million loss. And there was a report given to XM by an outside consultant, Brendan Rudd, who found that NewSat's management showed, quote, a complete lack of control on reining in costs. They included a $1.5 million raise for the CEO, $400,000 in undisclosed payments to a yacht business owned by the CEO's son, $10,000 dinners, various irregularities in trading and tax reporting. And Mr. Rudd, in his report, concluded, quote, I have never seen nor heard of more appalling corporate behavior than at NewSat. So, Mr. Hochberg, if the bank had successfully implemented the 2012 bill and the quote-unquote reforms that had been put in place, then we wouldn't have even been confronting NewSat. Is that correct?
We did I think we did a thorough due diligence and underwriting of that transaction. It was voted on by the board unanimously in 2012, and there was a revote in 2013 when there was a change in the transaction.
So you were saying that this was a good loan?
Congressman, we are in the business of making loans and supporting exports, about 250 direct exports from Lockheed Martin and 650 indirect. Every loan we make is not going to perform perfectly and flawlessly, and this is one that's, frankly, right now troubled. We're working through a solution. We are by nowhere near a solution at this point.
Well, it seems to me that either you knew about it and had some suspicions and went ahead with it, which would obviously be a bad decision, or you didn't have the systems in place to actually root it out. Either one of those is a bad scenario, and from my perspective. And it just, again, I come to the conclusion that it's beyond broken, and we simply are not going to be able to save the Export-Import Bank from itself. With that, Mr. Chairman, my time has run out.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Maloney, ranking member of our Capital Markets Subcommittee. You can hit the microphone to your right.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Hochberg. I feel that if there's a challenge such as my Republican colleague put forward, then correct it. But with 15 more working days for the House before the charter expires, I think it's important to look at an index of numbers that shows the good that it has done for the American economy. 60, that's the approximate number of export credit agencies operated by our competitors in an increasingly competitive global market. And they are just waiting for a chance to grab new businesses away from American exporters if our bank folds. 3,340. That's the number of small businesses directly supported by the services of the bank. And 164,000. That's the number of American jobs that will be lost without congressional action. 1.3 million. That's the number of private sector jobs the bank has supported since 2009 at no cost to the American taxpayer. And finally, 0. That's the good that will accrue if we allow our export bank to die. And if you look at recent numbers, last year alone, they supported $27.4 billion of exports, U.S. exports, at no cost to the taxpayer. Absolutely no cost to the taxpayer. So I think that in this competitive world, I would like approval to place in the record, unanimous approval, the export data analysis. And in this, China provided 17 times more support for their exports than the U.S., with approximately half the GDP.
Without objection.
And Canada alone provided more than 3 times more support for their exports than the U.S., and the U.S. had a GDP over 9 times larger than Canada. And there are 60 different countries that are providing support for their exports. So I strongly believe that we should not unilaterally disarm. If there is a challenge, if there is a problem, correct it. That's the American way. And go forward in supporting good jobs and our exports. And what I find so troubling is that in this committee, we have hearing after hearing on access to capital, how difficult it is for startups, small businesses, to find access to capital. Well, this is our access to capital. This is a way to help small businesses and large businesses export and create more American jobs. So I'd like to ask you, Mr. Hochberg, have you seen the private sector trade lenders stepping up during this period where you said there's uncertainty and people are looking for the financing, they don't know if they can get it, but are these private sector lenders coming in and providing the support? Or have these businesses simply been moving their production abroad to take advantage of other countries' export agencies?
Well, thank you, Congresswoman Maloney. What we have seen in the last 2 years, frankly, is the private sector, generally speaking, has stepped up a lot more. There's a lot more liquidity, there's a lot more bank lending, and there's been less of a requirement for our work, which is a good thing. It shows that the private sector is working better. However, in the small business space, they always have a difficulty. We have not really seen the private sector stepping up that strongly in small business. And to your last point, I think that you will see a number of companies, but they'll mostly be larger companies that actually have the ability to move production, may well move production offshore. You also may see that companies that were looking to locate here in the United States because we have a great workforce, rule of law, cheap energy or inexpensive energy. One of the things they also come here for is so they can export from here, and we're an important part of that factor.
Okay. Well, have you seen with our competitors, are they increasing their support for their export credit agencies or decreasing their support?
By and large, overwhelmingly increasing, and more of them are also getting into short-term lending, which actually benefits their small businesses. So I think we're going to see more competitive pressure on small business exporters as a result of more and more entities getting into the game.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Garrett, chairman of our Capital Markets Subcommittee.
So I thank the chairman for holding this very important hearing. And you know, when I was listening, Mr. Chairman, to your questions, I'm reminded of the essay "What is Seen and What is Not Seen" by Friedrich Bastiat, who wrote that essay to analyze our economies. Some things you can see and some things you can't. With XM, as the chairman was going down the list, you often report on what you can see. I presume, I understand, you use a ratio or analysis to come up with your figure of how many jobs that are either saved or created by looking at the billions of dollars of sales that multinational corporations make, and then multiply that by some job ratio to come up with, this is what all the good is that you're doing. Is that not appropriate analysis of how you come up with your job creation in short?
The jobs that we support are based on the actual authorizations, loans we've made to support U.S. exports, large companies and small.
Right, and so you do that by a job ratio, by the sales.
By the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They're not ours. We use the the Department of Labor.
Do you do a similar study of what the chairman was running down as far as the jobs that are lost or not created?
We do, and it was in our reform, which we updated, we do an economic impact study. We do it on every transaction to make sure that any benefits to our economy outweigh any possible harm.
Right. And so what it comes down to is that you really don't come through a list of all the winners and losers that the chairman was listing. Basically, you sit there and make that decision unilaterally. We're going to help these people, and we're going to hurt those people. We're going to help these sovereign countries. We're going to hurt American workers. We're going to help foreign institutions. We're going to hurt local businesses. You basically make that decision. And as I was listening to the chairman's question, as you ran down the list of U.S. companies, small and large, that are hurt in this manner, I think, how do you actually do that? How do you think about, or do you think about that worker here in the United States who has just lost his job because of your decision, about the woman who now no longer can make her mortgage payment because her U.S. job has been outsourced to another country because of your actions, about the child who no longer is able to go to college because they've lost their American job because of your action, about the harm that you are doing to American families on a daily basis because you're sitting there picking winners and losers. It's trauma to people when they lose their jobs. It's trauma to people when they're looking at having worked a lifetime with a small company and seeing that that job is now going to be exported overseas because of your decisions and of XM Bank. And I wonder, just how does anybody sit there on a daily basis and make those decisions, support multi-international companies, support foreign countries, and do that knowing that you are hurting that litany of companies that the chairman just listed here? And it's not companies, it's the people that you are hurting. And how do you make those decisions on a daily basis knowing that you are hurting families, hurting people, hurting children with those decisions? I just find that unimaginable. And you do it at the same time that you're saying you have an entity that is self-sustaining. Really? You're self-sustaining? If that's true, then I guess you don't need to be here at all. We can separate XM Bank as a self-sustaining, your words, not mine, entity without any U.S. government backstop, without any U.S. government support, and allow you to be in that position without the government backstop. So was your word a flippant word when you were saying it's self-sustaining, or is there more to it than that?
Congressman, self-sustaining refers to the fact that we collect fees for our work that fully pay for all of our costs, including loan loss reserves and the excess we
Well, of course, that's not actually true over the history of Ex-Im Bank, because Ex-Im Bank has been bailed out in the past, so it's not truly self-sustaining in that sense. And also in the sense that when you say, you take on the loans that banks won't. You take on the bank loans when banks won't step up to the plate and do it. And I have to think, why is it that the banks aren't making those loans? Is it because they're looking at it and saying, you know, as a president and a CEO, CFO of a bank, I have fiduciary duty to my stockholders, my investors, the mom and pops who invest in my banks, not to do something that's too risky, so I'm not going to make this loan to a risky venture. But you're all too willing to do so, aren't you? You're willing to do so not with your personal money, not with any of the people who are sitting in front of us right now with your money. You're willing to do it with my money and everybody else's money, that person that maybe that you just put out of a job, his money. So when you're saying that banks aren't willing to do it, you're willing to do it and put the American taxpayer, the worker, that very same worker that you put out of business, you're using his dollars and putting them at risk. I'll yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Velasquez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hochberg, small businesses are central to U.S. international trade, comprising the overwhelming majority of all exporting firms. Small or medium-sized companies with fewer than 500 employees comprise 97% of all export firms and were responsible for 33% of goods exports by value. So I would like to discuss with you the bank lending levels for small businesses. Since 2002, Ex-Im Reauthorization, the bank was provide at least 20% of total assistance to go to directly go to small businesses. Since 2007, the percentage has steadily declined and fell below the 20% mandate each year between 2010 and 2013. It recently grew to 25 in 2014 as a result of a sharp decrease in the bank's large business lending activity. So it is not, I believe, that because the bank did more to increase lending to small businesses, but because of the sharp decrease in lending to large businesses. My question to you is, given the fact that, and we are all using the argument here about the important role that the bank plays in lending for small businesses. You assisted 3,200 out of 25,000 small businesses in this country. I would like to see, first, that there is a commitment to increase the 25%, and what type of outreach will you do to make sure that we go beyond the 3,000 when we know that 97% of all exporters are small businesses, but yet they get less than 25% on small business lending?
Well, Congresswoman, I thank you.
And you know that I've been very critical of the bank regarding lending to small businesses and for ages now. So.
Well, we're right now above 20%. Our lending to small businesses directly is north of $5 billion, and we've been in that $5 billion range. It was in the threes when I joined the bank. We're also, although we don't count it, obviously there are a lot of indirect small business exporters. We now have a 800 number that's answered 8 to 8, Monday to Friday. In fact,
but we are not here to discuss indirect.
You asked me about what you asked
indirect.
about outreach.
We are talking about direct lending to small businesses.
You asked about outreach. I said we have a telephone operators 8 to 8, Monday to Friday. If you're on our website and you can't figure something out, we have online assistance there. We now have representation in about 12 different cities. We work very closely with the SBA and the Commerce Department. And on top of that, many members of this committee have invited me to their districts, and we have done half-day workshops. I just did that with Congressman Reed in Western New York just last week.
Okay, so let me ask you, given the fact that this bank plays such an important role in providing financing that the private market, private financial institutions do not make, would you support an amendment to increase the mandate to 25%?
I think the 20% is a good level to have. I don't want to, as was discussed at this meeting, pick winners and losers. I don't want to not do a certain transaction to simply meet a target, making sure we hit a certain target that's been established by Congress.
Well, since the reauthorization in 2002, the mandate has been 20%, and you never reached that
we've
mandate
exceeded that in the
until
last 2
last
years.
year.
We exceeded it last year, we're exceeding it this year.
Until last year. I just want to see that there is a strong commitment, given the fact that 97% of all exporters are small businesses, that should be reflected into the kind of financing that the bank is providing to small businesses.
Well, Mr. Boyle will be on the second panel as a small business owner. You might be able to ask him what his experience has been.
I understand, sir. I just want to make sure that the lending to small businesses is reflected in terms of the 25,000 small businesses that we have. Only 3,200 were served. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Duffy, chairman of our Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding today's hearing. My good friend, the ranking member, I have to give a couple of her quotes from earlier today. I think she said the XM Bank was an engine of economic growth. And she also said that letting the XM Bank expire would be harmful to the American economy. And as Mr. Huizenga pointed out, that hasn't always been the case of my friends across the aisle or the Democrat Party, because when Barack Obama was running for office, he called the XM Bank corporate welfare. And my good friend, the ranking member, she too called the XM Bank corporate welfare. She also told us that it would ship American jobs overseas because of cheap foreign labor. In the dissenting opinion from the ranking members and one Bernie Sanders from the House report from 2002, they said there are many examples of the Export-Import Bank subsidizing corporations that lay off American workers and move their production facilities overseas. But today, they're telling us that it is the engine of economic growth. So the question is, what's changed? What is different today than what they were saying in 2012? Mr. Hochberg, have you ever stayed at the White House?
In the 1990s?
With Mr. Clinton?
Yes, sir.
Lincoln bedroom?
No, it was actually a different bedroom.
Oh, okay. And you are an Obama bundler, correct? You were an Obama bundler, not ours.
I raised money for Mr. Obama.
Okay. Fair to say we could probably move from those answers what your political affiliation is. Boeing, the largest beneficiary of XM financing, their top lobbyist since 2008 is a former aide to Bill Clinton. In 2009, Secretary Clinton, President Clinton's wife, if you don't know, as the secretary, makes a shameless pitch in Russia that Russian airlines should buy Boeing airplanes, which I would like all airlines to buy our great American jets, but she's making a pitch as the Secretary of State. And then in 2010, a short while later, actually Boeing gets the contract for $3.7 billion. And after that, it's amazing, Boeing makes a $900 million contribution to the Clinton Foundation. 900,000, 9 million, sorry. Thank you, Bill. Boeing director William Daley is named President Obama's chief of staff in 2011. In June of 2011, John Bryson, Boeing director, named Obama's commerce secretary. Boeing top lobbyist in 2014 hosts a fundraiser for Ready for Hillary, the PAC that's supporting her campaign for president. And so I think what's changed is when you have Democrats who think they can get support from corporate welfare, they'll support it. If through corporate welfare they get campaign contributions, they will support it. And then it's about the American worker, the American economy. But if they're not getting contributions and they don't have their bundlers in the CEO president position, all of a sudden it's bad for the American worker and it's bad for the American economy. Mr. Hochberg, Did you say that you, the Ex-Im Bank, supports any eligible American business that seeks exports? Was that your quote?
That can find financing in the private sector.
Right, and you don't pick winners and losers.
That's correct.
And so I was reading an article from Reuters from a couple years ago that says the U.S. Export-Import Bank Board of Directors voted on Thursday not to proceed with the financing of U.S. exports to help build a coal-fired power plant in Vietnam, following a plea from U.S. environmental groups to stop the project. So isn't it fair to say that you support American jobs as long as it meets your ideological standards, but you don't support all American jobs because you would admit that the American jobs that would have come from building a coal-fired power plant are still American jobs?
Congressman, in 1992, Congress put into our charter that we must take into account the environmental impact as well as reasonable assurance repayment. That's been on our charter for 23 years. The bank was sued under President Bush for not following that mandate that's in our charter, and we lost.
So it's fair to say you support some American jobs, not all American jobs, correct?
We support jobs that fall within the mandate set forth by Congress in our charter.
So if you're making mining equipment in Wisconsin, or you work for a company that's trying to build power plants overseas, those jobs are the ones that won't fall into the financing of the Ex-Im Bank. Other clean energy jobs will, but not, in your view, dirty jobs.
Actually,
correct?
we support a lot of mining equipment from Wisconsin. We support coal exports.
After much pressure from the Wisconsin delegation, I might add.
No, we supported fully and freely mining equipment, coal exports as well.
We'll talk about that. I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hinojosa.
Thank you, Chairman Hensarling and Ranking Member Waters, for holding this hearing today. And thank you for our panelists for your testimony. I'd like to take a moment to state my unwavering support for the Export-Import Bank, and I call on our Honorable Chairman to let the majority of the House work its will and allow a vote on the reauthorization of the bank. The Export-Import Bank is a vital free market economic engine for our manufacturers, producers, and exporters, as has been pointed out before me. This March alone, the bank financed over $1 million in exports in my South Texas congressional district. Additionally, the bank has supported thousands of jobs in my district over the past 5 years. So these are good jobs in a very high need area that would not have been possible without the bank. Chairman Hochberg, many claim the bank is not needed and that it only supplements would-be private capital. Part of the bank's mandate is that the bank is not to compete with private capital. Can you tell us how the bank ensures that its loans go to support U.S. exports that would not otherwise be able to secure other financing?
Certainly, Congressman, thank you. On every application, the applicant must state why they're seeking Ex-Im financing. And they have to state whether it's because they can't secure financing in the private sector or they have to meet foreign competition. So that is part of the application, just like their financial statements are and everything else. So they certify that, and in most cases, we also can verify it independently.
Considering that the bank is a lender of last resort, stepping in when private financing alone is not available, do you believe the bank distorts the U.S. market negatively?
I believe we supplement the private sector because the private sector is the one that brings us in. If you go to a bank and you're looking for export finance, if the bank can't make the loan happen, they will come, they'll say, well, with an Ex-Im guarantee, we can. I was in Detroit, a company with small business engineering to the Mideast, and their banker was at the same roundtable. The banker said at Bank of America, without an Ex-Im guarantee, we told the client we will not take on that risk. So in that case, it was the bank that brought us in and said, with a Ex-Im guarantee, we can make that. And that small engineering firm is now providing services to the airport authority in Doha.
Thank you for that explanation. Chairman Hochberg, as you all know, the bank supports about 2% of U.S. exports. Last year, 2014, that amounted to $27.5 billion worth and 164,000 jobs. I find it funny that the bank's detractors love to point to that 2% figure as evidence that the bank's role is minuscule and unnecessary, but when, without a hint of irony, turn around and argue that the bank has huge negative market distorting effects. What do you think?
Well, I very much value the 164,000 jobs. I mean, those are family-sustaining jobs. Those are jobs in every state of this country. And those are jobs, exporter after exporter has said, without our support, those jobs would go away. Don Nelson, who has a company out in Bakersfield, California, said, quote, we would probably have to lay off 50 or 60 people without Ex-Im Bank support. Dave Eichert in the state of Texas, in Olney, Texas, has talked about we would have to lay off as many as 68 employees if the Ex-Im Bank is not reauthorized. So there's a very direct impact on jobs were we not to be reauthorized.
I thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Mulvaney, for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chairman. Mr. Hochberg, I promised you before the meeting that I wouldn't badger you today. I'm actually going to ask you some questions. I'm looking forward to the change of pace. I do want to come back and talk about the NewSat bankruptcy, however, very briefly for folks who aren't familiar with it. I think you all made a direct loan, a rare direct loan of roughly $100 million, probably a little bit more than that, to an Australian startup that was going to buy a satellite made by an American company. So you lent the money to the Australian company so they could buy an American satellite. The Australian company has since gone bankrupt, and it looks like you might be on the hook for $100 million. That's not my specific question. My questions deal with some of the comments made by the bankruptcy court, that apparently the bankruptcy court gave you the opportunity to protect your investment or your loan by finishing the project. You chose not to do so. And then more troubling, and let's start with this, apparently you had no security interest in the collateral. How is that possible?
Well, we had security in the company itself, but the company is in bankruptcy.
Satellite.
But the satellite is right now being manufactured by Lockheed Martin. So
and who owns the satellite?
At the current time, Lockheed Martin has possession.
Free and clear of any security interest of the Export-Import Bank of the United States of America, right?
Which is typical because they're making the product. They actually have possession of it.
You lent $100 million to an Australian startup and kept no security interest, no collateral at all?
We would have had collateral at the completion of the satellite, not while it's being
And you had the ability to fund the completion of the satellite, and you chose not to do so.
We chose not to complete the satellite until we knew there was going to be an actual buyer who was going to take it.
And ultimately, that's not happened. And you
well, right now, that's in negotiations.
No, I'm just reading. It says the export. I'm reading from an article in Space News from just 2 days ago. The Export-Import Bank, for reasons that were not clearly explained, the U.S. Justice Department lawyer representing the bank referred vaguely to, quote, policy/business decisions, end quote, refused to put up any funds to preserve its sunk cost in the project. The bankruptcy court judge in the May 21st hearing expressed surprise that the Ex-Im Bank, with so much at stake, was unable to present a credible go-forward scenario by the May 18th deadline. It then goes on to say the status of the satellite, you're out $100 million, and I think it's Lockheed Martin has a satellite free and clear that they can sell. You've lost $100 million, and you've given a several $100 million windfall to Lockheed Martin at the expense of the taxpayer. How do you defend that type of lending?
First of all, sir, this transaction is still in negotiation. We're still negotiating for an ultimate buyer of the satellite.
Did the bankruptcy court give you a May 18th deadline?
We had a May 18th deadline.
How did that go?
And we could not find a secured buyer. We could not identify a clear buyer by May 18th. We asked for a few extra days, and Lockheed Martin refused.
So it's a correct statement in the article. It says, quote, it is now in the, that $193 million was mainly Ex-Im money lent to NewSat in addition to equity NewSat had raised on its own. It is now in the form of a nearly completed spacecraft that Lockheed Martin owns and is free to sell without having to pay anything to Ex-Im. That's an accurate statement, isn't it?
No, we are fully backed by NewSat. So NewSat still has control over that satellite.
NewSat's bankrupt.
NewSat may be bankrupt, but we're secured by NewSat. And frankly, Congressman, when we had an opportunity to simply, quote unquote, throw good money after bad without a clear exit plan, we chose not to do that.
I'll come back. I guess, Mr. McCarthy, I'll ask you this. Was one of your recommended reforms at the bank that they actually start looking at their lending practices with an eye towards getting security interest and collateral? I don't know of any bank that would lend money like that with no collateral at all?
In the 2012 reauthorization, one of the requirements is that the bank not be a subordinate lender, and so it would be first in line. As part of the due diligence process—
Let me cut you off right there. Hold on a second. That was part of the 2012 reauthorization. Earlier today, Mr. Hochberg, you said that this loan was reviewed twice. It was originally reviewed by your board and approved, I can't remember when, but it was reviewed and approved, reapproved by the board in 2013 after the 2012 reauthorization. Did you?
We were not subordinate in any of those cases, sir.
Okay. Mr. McCarthy, help me here. Okay, so they're not subordinate, but why don't they have collateral? I guess the point is, the reason you would not have them be subordinate is that would put them in a second position where their collateral, if any, would be impaired, correct?
That's correct.
And essentially what you have is a position where your collateral's impaired because you don't have any to begin with. So I guess, Mr. Hochberg, again, I promised I wouldn't badger you. I have 14 seconds, and I'm sure that's what people think that I'm doing. Do you think you followed good process when you made the new SAT loan?
At the time, yes.
How about now?
And I believe now we're working towards a solution. This is not over yet, sir.
If you make a new loan today, will you get collateral in whatever it is you are financing?
We had the collateral in NewSat. We had the collateral in the actual entity.
But thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Capuano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I don't have any questions of the witnesses because the truth is I don't know how I'm going to vote on XM. I'm leaning towards voting for it mostly because of competitive reasons, as I've said many times. Every other country we compete with has one. Therefore, we should have one. That doesn't mean everything you've done is wonderful. It doesn't mean I agree with every loan. It doesn't mean there shouldn't be reform. I came over because as I was watching this, I probably shouldn't have done that. I probably should have had something else on. But as I was watching this hearing, I got to be honest, the people that are arguing against you the most vociferously, not all of them, but many of them are losing the argument because they turn it into a personal attack as a political basis. This is an important substantive issue, one that I am open to discussing, one that I'm certainly open to amending, and yet all I hear is, well, 100 years ago somebody did this and somebody said that, and somebody voted this way and somebody changed their mind. God forbid an elected official ever changes their mind on an important and complicated issue like the Ex-Im Bank. God forbid any of you ever change your mind. And by the way, if you really want to win the issue, you really need to change some minds because you lost the Republican conference in 2012 when we voted for it. 147 Republicans voted to reauthorize the Ex-Im. Only 93 voted against it. If you want to change our minds, you really got to do a little bit better than attacking the president and attacking people who did change their minds. You really got to stick to the subject matter. And I respect people that disagree with me. But I got to tell you, I completely lose respect. I lose interest on the fact, oh, you changed your mind. I got the whole list of names of the Republican side who voted for it in 2012, many of whom are here right this very minute. Now, you may change your mind. If you do, God bless you. But if you ever change your mind on anything else and you keep this nonsense up, I guarantee you I'll be keeping score. And we'll all get down in the gutter and we'll all get down in the street and call each other names and accomplish nothing. This is an important, difficult issue that reasonable people can disagree on. And honestly, I appreciate some of the things, even some of the things I don't agree with. Okay. But I came to ask my colleagues to stop the nonsense. If you really don't like the Ex-Im Bank because you really think it's corporate welfare and bad for America, fine. Argue to win the hearts and minds of the American people and your colleagues, whom you lost in 2012. You want some people to change their minds. How are you going to get people to change their minds when you constantly say anyone who changes their mind is somehow inherently wrong and evil? Then you're going to lose again based on your own Republican conference. Almost all the people that voted in this in 2012 are still here. So that's what I came to say. I was actually thinking about reading out names, but I don't want to denigrate down to that nonsense. I will, and I think you all know I can if I want to. But on this issue, I'd really rather hear substantive facts, important questions. I think the last series of questions were pretty good. They raised some serious issues. Now, I got to be honest, just because there's been some problems in the past, I'm not interested in shutting something down, because if that's the case, we better shut down the DOD. They've had people steal money. My God almighty. We should shut down the entire Defense Department because somebody stole money. The entire Agricultural Department because somebody once took a loan that they shouldn't have gotten. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't raise the issue, but that doesn't go to the basis of whether we need to open or close the bank. That might open up some discussion about reforms, and I'm more than interested in hearing it. I've actually told, who was it, Delta, that's so opposed to this. I've also told them, look, you raised some good issues. Let's talk about how we deal with the issues you raise. But I don't get that. All I get is personal attacks, political attacks, which I'm pretty good at. But on this one, if you really think you're going to win elections, you're going to change people's minds, you're going to win the issue, you're going to have to explain to me how the very people you need to change their minds, you're calling them names. With that, Mr. Chairman, I apologize for not asking any questions of the witnesses, but I look forward to going back to my office, turning the TV back on, and learning something. I hope, and if not, I'll just change the channel like the rest of America. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Lucas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to question our good friends, and I don't know that I have a particular series of questions I want to ask. I just would like to observe that in my time on this committee, now 20-plus years, I've observed lots of discourse and lots of discussion. We've always been a very philosophical group. We've argued the joys of Karl Marx and Adam Smith, and we've ground on each other day in and day out on a variety of things. But the issue that we've now had hearings on into almost nauseam is not just a philosophical issue, it's a real economic issue. It's a real bread and butter issue back home amongst the good folks. Everyone knows that my perspective is that in a competitive world economically, you've got to be able to go punch for punch, blow for blow. You've got to do what is necessary to give our fellow citizens a chance to prosper economically, to have good jobs, to grow our economy. I view export-import as one of those tools in the battle with 60 other countries around the world. I sincerely believe that whether it is 14 days or 14 weeks or 14 months, this institution will be reauthorized. It may take a number, if it's allowed to officially expire, a number of occasions where U.S. companies lose business, substantial business around the world, to help us focus. I prefer not to have that happen. But that's what it may take. I would ask all of my colleagues, the course we're on here leads us in the direction of either allegedly ending the bank completely, or I fear reauthorizing it in the exact form it was or is this moment. That's missing out on an opportunity to build on the reforms of the previous reauthorization. That's missing out on an opportunity to address legitimate problems that have been brought up. It's missing out on an opportunity, I think, ultimately to give the participants in our economy more effective tools to compete around the world. Right now, this moment, the Agriculture Committee, another committee I serve on, is having a hearing about foreign subsidies and how it affects food sales around the world and production and all those kind of things. You might be surprised to know that it's a pretty tough place out there competing economically. It's really kind of vicious. Do whatever you have to do, my friends, from your philosophical perspectives. But don't in a competitive world say that we are going to establish a principle so perfect, so idealistic, so philosophically straightforward that everyone else will flock to it. That's not the way it works. Just not the way it works. You don't negotiate from a position of surrender. You negotiate from a position of strength. Again, I've enjoyed these philosophical hearings. It's reminiscent of many different periods in the last 20 years on this committee. But 14 days, 14 weeks, 14 months we'll reauthorize export-import. And we'll, I fear, reauthorize exactly what we have. That would be a horrible opportunity missed. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to do something out of character in Congress. I'm going to yield back some time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, ranking member of our Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the ranking member as well. Mr. Chairman, it has been my experience that there is a process that can extricate us from differences. We have policy that we differ on, and the process is the thing that can give us an opportunity to resolve these differences in policy positions. I recall very vividly the process that allowed us to make a policy decision with reference to life and death in the Shivo case. I recall coming back after having just landed in Houston, Texas, and on short notice, to take a vote. It was very late at night when we ultimately took that vote. But the process allowed us to resolve a question involving life and death. The process is the means by which we resolve questions of war and peace. We can have our differences about where we should station our military, what the military should be doing. But ultimately, when these differences are to be resolved, we have a process that allows us to do so. We vote, and we have voted in this Congress, not this particular Congress, but in the Congress of the United States of America, on questions of war and peace. The budget, we have our differences about whether or not we should cut or expand certain programs, whether sequestration is a proper process. And when we confronted the question of sequestration, we allowed the process itself to dictate a resolution to a policy question. That process was to vote. I'm calling on all of our leadership to allow the process to work, not just in the committee level, but let's take this to the floor of the Congress of the United States of America. And let's do what we were sent here to do, debate the great issues of our time. And let us, after having a robust debate, have a process function as intended. Let us vote. I may not like the results, but I will respect the process. I believe the American people are expecting us to take a vote as to whether or not the EXIM Bank will continue or whether it will become a part of the ash heap of history. Personally, I will vote to extend the EXIM Bank. It has done meaningful things. It has made a difference in the lives of the people that I represent. I and Mr. Hochberg had an opportunity to visit with a business in Houston, Texas. And there's an interesting thing about these businesses. Many of the small businesses that benefit don't benefit directly, they benefit indirectly from larger businesses that they associate themselves with. Many of them are off the radar in the sense that we can identify them immediately as beneficiaries. But because of their connectivity and their association with larger businesses, there's an emolument that inures to the benefit of the people that I represent. I want the process that has worked for this country, that has time-honored positive benefits. I want that process to continue. And I call on all of our leadership to please give the process a chance. The policy can be resolved if the process is allowed to function. And I will yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman. Now the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Westmoreland, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hochberg, in November of 2012, the Board approved the economic impact analysis guidelines that were required in Section 12 of the 2012 EXIM bank reauthorization. Would it surprise you if the analysis was engineered to favor one company or another?
Congressman, we actually revised our entire economic impact procedures. Congress asked us to review that in the 2012, and we made some adjustments throughout the entire process of economic impact.
You made adjustments. Did you make those adjustments with consultation to any of your customers?
Without question. We, of course, consulted many of our customers because we wanted to have a policy that works for our customers and works for our exporters. So we, of course, did that.
You know, I'm just a slow country boy from Georgia, but reading some of the emails, some of the correspondence between your staff and Boeing staff, something just doesn't smell right to me. I don't know if you've ever heard the word collusion, but have you read those emails?
I've read the reports in the paper, sir.
Have you read the emails?
I've seen some of them, yes.
And do they seem funny to you?
Out of context, they look rather funny, but they're out of context. What we're trying to do, sir, is if we were writing regulations, guidelines for farm equipment, we would talk to the 5 companies that make farm equipment.
Okay.
So in the case, we only have one aircraft manufacturer.
Okay. I want to read one, or part of one from Mr. Moran. And he was advising the Boeing Capital that subjecting and applying transactions to detailed analysis under economic impact procedures has had the effect of killing most of those aircraft deals. Mr. McCarthy, have you read these emails?
We're familiar with those emails. We're familiar with them.
You are, and you didn't find anything funny with them?
So right now, we're working on a report on the economic impact guidelines. We had a report in 2010 that made certain recommendations. We're doing a follow-up report that is looking at not only implementation of our 2010 recommendations, but also implementation of the requirements in the 2012 reauthorization. And we're including this matter that you're raising as part of that review.
Okay. Well, 2012, it's taken you a while to get to that, but you know, between, there's another email where Mr. Cruz told the board, given the historical distribution and nature of aircraft cases, it is anticipated only 10 to 15% of the cases would go through the new procedure. This comes after a series of emails that he had, and besides that and the fact that Mr. Moran didn't want complete transparency, I just wonder if it was brought to the board's attention of these specific requests for analysis that would influence their acceptance of these new procedures.
Excuse me. Just to go back, we've had economic impact procedures back to 1968, and we've adjusted them periodically over time. We actually voluntarily added aircraft seats as part of that category on our own because of concerns from the public. So these are things we've done voluntarily, and we're constantly updating them. We updated them in 2012. The board voted on them, and we actually conduct a review of every transaction. And if we find there's enough findings there, we do an in-depth review. But every transaction is reviewed for its economic impact procedure. Well, Congress has set the threshold of 1%. If it adds 1% of global capacity over U.S. capacity, it would trigger a more detailed analysis.
Well, I know it all depends on if you use the twin aisle, the single aisle, the number of seats. I mean, all of that is discussed in the emails between the Boeing staff and your staff. As far as what numbers to use. And as Mr. Green, my friend from Texas, stated, the process needs to work. And when you're trying to get this information, do you think it's proper that your staff would be conversing with Boeing staff into how to make these numbers look right to justify your ability to make them the loans?
Well, it's a public process. We had a low number of public meetings. We actually invited committee staff to join us. We post every transaction in the Federal Register, and we went through this is standard procedure and process that we do for economic impact.
Well, I don't think that's a standard procedure process, but my time's expired. Thank you, Chair.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, ranking member of our Housing and Insurance Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Hochberg, for visiting some of the subcontractors who are involved with Ex-Im Bank in the 5th District of Missouri. Mr. McCarthy, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions. Do you have any information that would lead you to believe that the Ex-Im Bank is competing with private sector banks or lending institutions?
We haven't done that particular analysis. We did do a report on the direct loan program a few years back, looking at how the bank tracked that information and made recommendations that it needed to do a better job of requesting documentation from applicants as to why they were unable to obtain private sector financing, and they've implemented changes there.
But the bank is self-funding and self-sufficient?
Yes, our audited financial statements have found that they are fairly presented.
I'm not sure, but prior to Ronald Reagan being sworn in as president, there was very little controversy as it relates to the Ex-Im Bank. Since that time, there have been times when Democrats and Republicans have challenged the existence of the Ex-Im Bank. I'm not sure why or so forth, but about a year ago, I think, I attended a meeting on the second floor, I believe, and the amazing thing at that meeting was that as I sat there with other members of Congress, all of the business leaders sitting in front of us asking that we support the Ex-Im Bank were people who had given money to my opponents and to the opponents of most of us sitting up listening to these folks. It was one of the amazing moments in Congress. I talk about this when I'm out speaking. Business leaders from all over asking me to support something that they felt strongly about, even though they had given money to the opponents, my opponents. I thought it was just amazing. And so I have come to the conclusion that, you know, I guess both sides switch and swap and do silly stuff, and sometimes it's at the detriment of the agency. Mr. Hartsburg, a couple of things. I think there are 60 or 70 other nations with similar banks. Are most of them in the industrialized world?
Most of them are, and actually we did a survey this year, and the number is now above 80. 80 different export credit agencies that are doing long, short-term, and medium-term loans.
And so if we discontinue the Ex-Im Bank, we're actually withdrawing from what most of the Western world is doing, trying to support the exportation of goods to foreign countries.
Exactly. We'd be unilaterally disarming. We'd have no seat at the table if we want to ratchet down export credits. We'd have no say in the matter because we wouldn't be a participant.
The way the Export-Import Bank debate is going, do you think that it's having any impact right now? For example, are you able to, because of the uncertainty, are you able to do any long-term planning, long-term considerations of requests?
Well, we have authority until June 30th. larger transactions over $100 million come to Congress for a 35-day review. That period has passed, so we have a number of transactions that are up here during that 35-day review period. So we hope to consider those before the end of June, but any large transaction we consider from now on, if we're not reauthorized, would not get a final approval by the bank.
Okay, thank you. Mr. McCarthy, a one-word answer may be okay since my time is running out. Do you have you found that there is waste and fraud and abuse in the Ex-Im Bank?
We're the Inspector General. We always find waste, fraud, and abuse. We have had some cases, as I reported. We've had some serious cases of employee misconduct.
I'm familiar with those.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Pittenger, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hochberg, there was a review that found that many businesses have been categorized improperly as that were big corporations, foreign conglomerates. They're categorized as small businesses, those owned by Warren Buffett and others. One business had 53,000 employees. How do you account for that categorization?
Congressman, we obviously take data accuracy very seriously. It's one of the key principles we've applied this year. The Reuters report went back over 6, 7, 8 years. It found a 3% error rate. We strive for a 0% error rate. I will tell you one other thing. As a business owner, businesses are dynamic. Some years you're small, some years you're large. You may be a small business and sold to a large company.
53,000 is quite a number. Let me ask you this. Is it accurate that 40% of the export-imports authorizations in 2014 went to one company, Boeing?
I think it's a little less than that, but it's around a third.
Very significant amount.
Well, it didn't go to Boeing. It went to customers of Boeing. Boeing does not get 1 penny from the Export-Import Bank. Boeing does not derive a single dime from the Export-Import Bank.
According to your own data, 60% of the Ex-Im Bank's financing benefited just 10 large corporations in 2013. Is that correct?
And about
That's your data.
39% went to small businesses directly.
But just to 10 companies, 60%. How big is your loan portfolio?
Our portfolio is about $112 billion.
Well, at the end of 2014, less than around 45% of the Ex-Imports exposure is concentrated to just air transportation. Correct?
Air transportation, aircraft is our largest single export in the country.
Exactly. And you had 45%. And I say that in light of just folks in small business. You know, there's a lady who runs a machine business in South Carolina, Rachel Cox. She's got 30 employees. You know, they have a machine business. Here's her comment. She said, quote, "When I researched the Ex-Im Bank and especially the sign-up process, it became clear that it is designed for large businesses. The amount of information that was required was overwhelming at best and invasive at least. After some consideration, I decided against it." Now, by the direction or design or how the Ex-Im Bank executes its plans, it appears very strongly that your efforts are sizably favoring very large businesses. 10 businesses, 60% of your financing. Here's a small business who says, it's too cumbersome for me. It's too overwhelming. So we multiply that times many times. How do you justify that in the way of performing an institution that's really supposed to be favoring small business, and yet here's someone who can't get access?
Well, I'd actually like to meet that customer and speak with her, but I will tell you directly, we're trying to balance ease of doing business with also risk management. This committee has made it very clear wants to see our default reports every 90 days. So we're trying to balance
She
the
couldn't
risk
even
of the
get through
portfolio.
your reports, even to get access.
But we're trying to balance the information so we do good underwriting, but at the same time, don't make it too cumbersome for customers. And we're constantly working that to find a better balance. But I'd be happy to talk to your constituent to find out what was it, because I'd like to learn more about our customers.
Just one other thing. You know, the CBO accounting reflected that the methods that you use, if you use fair value accounting, that you'd had significantly higher subsidy rates would be revealed. You have stated, of course, that you're profitable. How do you justify not using fair value accounting, and do you believe that you should?
Well, the law of the land is the Federal Credit Reform Act of 1990, so we follow the law of the land and we use that accounting method. You know, I was in business for 20-plus years. You have one set of books and you follow the law of the land. The law of the land
The CBO says that if you use fair value accounting, that you would cost taxpayers $2 billion. Do you believe on your own account that you should be using fair value accounting?
I follow the law of the land, and I also dispute that number from CBO.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore, Ranking Member of our Monetary Policy and Trade Subcommittee.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to raise a point of personal privilege and not be charged, my time not be charged for it.
Do you have a point of order?
Point of personal privilege, yes, sir.
You can make a parliamentary inquiry. I'm uncertain as to what the point of personal privilege is.
My point, I'd like to make a point of personal privilege.
Well, we'll certainly hold the clock and allow the lady to begin to make her point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to thank this committee on both sides of the aisle for really supporting me during a very painful couple of weeks. Death of my sister. I've gotten flowers and cards and calls, and you just don't know how important that has been to me. And I just am overwhelmed with gratitude, and I wanted to thank you, Mr. Chairman, you, Madam Ranking Member, for caring about me as a person and not just a committee member.
I know I speak for the entire committee on both sides of the aisle to let you know what a valued friend and colleague you are, and how our hearts were heavy with your loss.
Thank you so much.
And now the clock can start anew, and we will yield the gentlelady her 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the panel for appearing again here, and I can tell you that I'm sort of unhappy that Mr. Huizenga, my very good friend from the Midwest, is not here, because I really want to clear something up. I think the not so surreptitiously veiled strategy to pluck the low-hanging fruit of the Ex-Im Bank from the vine as a raison d'etre to get into Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, the so-called entitlement programs. I mean, Mr. Huizenga said it very straightforwardly. We've heard it time and again that how can you pluck into these social programs if you can't even bring down the Ex-Im Bank? So I think it's a straw man argument. So I guess my first question, and I had intended to engage in a colloquy with him, and if the chairman or someone else would like to do that, I would yield time. But otherwise, I would ask Mr. Hochberg, how does the structure of the Ex-Im Bank, how is it similar to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, such that it is persistently called corporate welfare? How is it similar or dissimilar from the gas and oil business, who through our tax expenditures every year get about $4.8 billion from the government? Can you share with us the structure of the Ex-Im Bank as compared to SNAP?
Well, I'm a little confused as well by some of these comparisons. Customers, clients, exporters pay a fee for their service. It's fee for service. They pay a fee. The fee fully covers all of our operating costs, all of our loan loss reserves, and then generates a surplus that goes to the taxpayers for deficit reduction. So we're not transferring money from one group of taxpayers to another. We're actually transferring money from customers to the taxpayers, from outside entities to the taxpayers. Many times those are foreign buyers. So I don't understand the comparison.
I don't either. I thought maybe you would understand it better than I do. Let me ask you, one of the things that seems to get under the craw of some of our members of our committee is the mandate that you all have to do clean energy stuff, and that you're picking winners and losers. And so I'm reflecting on the $4.8 billion that is transferred to the oil and gas industry through tax expenditures. And I want to compare that $4.8 billion a year to whatever subsidy that the government perceives that you get from them. Even using their accounting system, how does $4.8 billion a year compare to what the government does for the Exim Bank?
Well, we transfer money to the government from the Exim Bank. We don't receive money from the government. So there's no subsidy that goes to Exim. And by World Trade Organization, WTO, we need to be self-sustaining, meaning the fees we collect have to, at a minimum, cover all of our costs. And in this case, they cover more than our costs.
So we have usually running a debt clock, and I'm wondering, to what extent would our trade deficit increase were we not to reauthorize the bank, in your opinion?
Well, I only can tell you in the last 20 years we have transferred just under $7 billion for deficit reduction to reduce the debt, just under $7 billion over that 20-year period. $675 million as recently as October.
Okay, so this notion, that you pick winners and losers, I'm wondering, Mr. IG, have you seen anything in your examination of the Exim Bank that suggests that they pick winners and losers?
We haven't received any allegations along the lines of the process being skewed in favor in particular transactions. The bank has controls and processes in place. They have to do due diligence. The applicants have to meet certain credit standards. We haven't seen any evidence of cases where they seem to be favoring one particular party or another and not following their own guidelines on that. The structure of the guidelines are set by Congress and set by bank policy.
And thank you. My time has expired.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Hochberg, you and I have talked extensively about the Exim Bank's announcement following President Obama's Climate Action Plan in June of 2013 and the bank's guidelines for high carbon projects in December. I know you've answered this question before, but in light of that policy adopted by the bank's board of directors, do you believe that the Export-Import Bank chooses winners and losers in U.S. industries?
No, we don't. But we do have a standard that Congress has put in our charter since '92 that we must take the environment into account.
So you've got the charter, which is a policy of picking winners and losers, a policy that favors renewables over fossil energy projects, and then you have this additional codification of the policy of picking winners and losers, which was the December 13th guidelines.
Well, what you referred to, much of this is actually in our charter.
Right. So the charter is inherently part of the policy of the bank, which interjects political judgments about what energy projects are worthy of financing versus others. What is wrong with that analysis?
Well, Congress's judgment makes a decision on what guides our behavior. So these are all been
right.
passed by Congress.
Okay, fine. You can blame it on Congress,
I'm not blaming
But you, sir, in response to President Obama's climate action plan and in announcing your board's discriminatory policy against coal-fired power, said this, quote, "Without guidelines or limits, ever-increasing numbers of new coal plants worldwide will just continue to emit more carbon pollution into the air we breathe. I strongly support the administration's efforts to build international consensus such that other nations follow our lead in, quote, restricting, unquote, financing of new coal-fired power plants." How is that not a policy of picking winners, renewables, or nuclear, or non-coal fossil energy over coal, loser? How is that not picking winners and losers?
Well, sir, we finance a lot of coal exports. We finance coal mining equipment, but we have a restriction about financing coal-fired power plants except in very poor countries.
Right, you are not letting the marketplace dictate this. So what does the marketplace say? Here's what the marketplace is saying right now. The marketplace is saying that the demand for coal-fired power, particularly in lesser developed countries, is skyrocketing. The International Energy Agency concludes that 1,000 gigawatts of coal capacity will be built globally by 2040 at a cost of $2.5 trillion, irrespective of American policy. Here's what the IEA says. In the World Energy Outlook, the use of coal for power generation will continue to increase until at least 2035 to 2040 and will remain an integral part of the energy mix long after that. Here is the sad conclusion that I draw. The United States has the best, most environmentally friendly energy technology on the planet with respect to coal-fired power. Your bank's decision to not finance coal-fired power projects overseas with American clean coal technology is resulting in China financing these projects and using inferior electric generation technology. The bank's policy, ironically, is contributing to a worse environmental result. Is there any response to that, and China's export credit agencies doing the job that you won't do?
First of all, we will finance coal-fired power plants in poor countries. In those developing countries, we will certainly do so. We haven't had an application.
Okay. So you're citing an exception with poor countries. So my question is this: have you, since you announced the guidelines, has your board agreed to finance a coal-fired power plant in a lesser developed country?
We have not received an application.
Have you invoked that exception? Because China is not. China is financing coal-fired power. India is financing coal-fired power projects. Do you think they have better technology in generating coal power than we do?
Well, the U.S. government's in negotiation with China and others to restrict it globally.
Well, okay, so in 2030, and if you trust China, that's a great assumption. But doesn't allowing an exception for lesser developed countries, doesn't that actually imply in the policy itself that coal-fired power plants have benefits as cheap and reliable sources of energy for poor countries?
Short answer from the witness, please.
There is a benefit for poor countries, exactly. That's why the exception's there.
Okay, well, my time has expired, but I think we've proven the point that the bank will always pick winners and losers.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I have a graphic that I'd like displayed and, without objection, entered into the record. It is simply a plot of the number of manufacturing jobs in the United States over the last several administrations. It's interesting to look at the trend here. That you see, for example, in the Kennedy administration, we had the strongest period of job growth in our country's history. In the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. Then in the Nixon-Ford administrations, the number of manufacturing jobs dropped. It went up during the Carter years, down during the Reagan years, down further during the first Bush administration, roughly level during the Clinton administration, and then we suffered a catastrophic drop due to the policies of the second Bush administration. We now are beginning to grow manufacturing jobs again largely by returning to the policies that have historically supported strong growth of U.S. manufacturing. You know, I'm best known as being, I guess, the last PhD scientist in Congress, but I'm also a manufacturer. The company that my younger brother and I started with $500 from my parents now manufactures the majority of theater lighting equipment in the United States. We do hardware, software, sheet metal painting, customer support, and we've kept all those jobs in the Midwest, which is something I'm extremely proud of. And so as much as anything, it was this collapse that got me to leave my career in science and in business to go into one and to try to make a difference here. Because you can see it makes a difference what the policies are. You know, both parties talk as though their policies are pro-job, pro-growth, pro-manufacturing, but you can see there's a real difference in the actual result. And the statistics on the number of administrations, the number of times we've gone back and forth between what we support. And as a scientist, I think the conclusions here are pretty clear. I leave it up to the audience or the students here to deduce what the color coding on the arrows means. And so actually, with that out of the way, there are a couple of it's interesting actually to talk about what was responsible for this tremendous drop. Well, we lost over a third of our manufacturing jobs in the last decade. The three biggest causes of that, in my mind, are first and foremost currency manipulation. We let China into the World Trade Organization without any agreement that they not manipulate their currency, and U.S. manufacturers, as a result, had a significant artificial cost disadvantage for most of a decade, for longer than a decade now. We had also a wave of subsidized or guaranteed credit for exporters in other countries that, frankly, we did not match. That is the subject of this hearing, whether guaranteed export credit is actually an important countervailing thing that we have to do. In a perfect world, we would not need the Export-Import Bank. But I think it provides, in the presence of subsidized credit from around the world for their exports, I think it is essential. My attitude is very much that we should put down our weapon when they put down theirs and not before. The third factor, of course, is the enormous tax breaks for those already wealthy that happened during the Bush administration, where those already wealthy, instead of reinvesting their productive assets back into the United States, simply turned the money over to their money managers, who more and more invested that money offshore. Very different than what happened during the Kennedy administration, for example, when we had very different tax rates. But since we're concentrating on the second item there, the credit, the guaranteed credit for exports, I have a couple of questions for Chairman Hochberg. First, you'd received some criticism earlier in this hearing about your dealings with foreign state-owned enterprises. And do you run a profit or a loss in your dealings with foreign state-owned enterprises?
Well, we run an overall profit at the agency, and we turn that over to the taxpayers every October.
Okay, and does that include your dealings with foreign-owned enterprises?
It certainly does.
Okay, so the taxpayer is better off because of your dealings with foreign state-owned enterprises. And the second thing is I'm increasingly concerned with these 11th hour reauthorizations that you are suffering through. It seems to me that creates exactly the kind of uncertainty that ruins deals, drives equipment purchases to foreign competitors. What kind of impact along those lines might you have seen already because of the brinksmanship going on here?
Well, we've already seen, we had one testimony last year from Steve Wilburn that lost a deal to the Philippines that was taken over by the South Korea, and we've also seen banks pull back and insurance brokers already pull back and deny credit to small businesses.
Okay, thank you. It looks like I'm out of time. I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Hochberg, Michael Grunwald, in a Politico magazine article from earlier this year, the article titled "The Real Bank of America," described the more than $3 trillion in loans that the federal government, that's the hardworking American taxpayers, are on the hook in case of defaults. And that $3 trillion does not count the more than $15 trillion in other guarantees that the federal government is on the hook for. And at a time when our national debt exceeds $18 trillion, and in the wake of the massive bailouts at Fannie and Freddie, it's imperative that any efforts I believe, to reauthorize XM must take steps to ensure that taxpayers are fully protected from the possibility of potential losses. And here Mr. McCarthy identified one of XM's biggest challenges is risk management. One way that we could potentially create additional protections for American taxpayers is by requiring full collateralization or sovereign guarantees for all direct loans or loan guarantees issued by the bank. As noted in the bank's FY16 congressional budget justification, only 77% of the bank's portfolio is currently backed by a form of asset or collateral security. The percentage increases to 80% when including sovereign guarantees. You know, a reasonable person might think this should be 100% collateralization. Would you be supportive of making this a requirement for XM loans or loan guarantees?
I would not.
Another way that we can protect the American taxpayer from potential XM losses is by requiring additional guarantees from U.S. exporters who directly benefit from the bank's providing of loans or loan guarantees to the foreign purchasers of their products. Specifically, we could require that as a prerequisite for any loan or loan guarantee, the U.S. exporter must both guarantee full repayment of any money extended to a foreign purchaser and take the necessary steps to ensure that this guarantee is senior to other obligations. This would create an additional barrier and source of repayment before any losses would be placed on the backs of the taxpayer. Would you support this reform?
No, I would not.
You know, it's interesting to read, and I'm just learning about the NewSat bankruptcy. And in this article in Space News, it says that $193 million was mainly XM money lent to NewSat. In addition to equity NewSat had raised on its own, it is now in the form of a nearly completed spacecraft that Lockheed Martin owns and is free to sell without having to repay anything to XM. Now, if XM or if Lockheed sells the satellite, you have no agreement right now with Lockheed that they would have to go back and pay XM for that loss. Is that right?
We are still working on a solution to this transaction. It is simply, it's early in the stage, sir, and so we're trying to find an actual buyer together who will buy the satellite.
But you have no legal document that you can go back if Lockheed goes and sell, because it owns the satellite, and it's certainly free to go and sell it, correct?
Lockheed has possession of it, but we're working with Lockheed and other creditors to find a solution so that we actually do not suffer a loss in this particular case.
The 2012 reauthorization directed Treasury to pursue negotiations to substantially reduce, with the ultimate goal of eliminating subsidized export financing programs and other forms of export subsidies. There has been essentially no progress on this front at all, as most recently confirmed by Treasury's Undersecretary for International Affairs, Nathan Sheets, in the testimony before the committee on April 15, 2015. Who do you blame for this failure?
Well, as I understand, first of all, this is the Secretary of the Treasury is responsible, but he's issued 3 reports about their efforts to rein in export finance globally. I understand this is the Treasury Secretary's responsibility, but it's to rein it in. We have to get outside parties like China, like Brazil, like India, like Russia, that aren't even a party to it, before we ratchet down everybody else. Let's make sure we get everybody following the rules. Then we can ratchet everybody down.
Have you done anything personally to make sure that this requirement is fulfilled?
Well, as I mentioned in my oral testimony, although this is the Treasury Secretary's responsibility, I have gone out of the way to speak to all of my colleagues and ask them how we would do this.
XM is currently open to support foreign purchases of U.S. exports in almost 200 countries around the world. The bank is prohibited from extending credit and insurance to certain countries, for example, those that are in armed conflict with the United States. But it can still provide services in many countries that have horrific records on issues pertaining to human trafficking and the protection of internationally recognized human rights, including the freedom of religion. Would you support simple, common-sense reforms that would further limit the bank's country limitation schedule to prohibit countries that are refusing to take the necessary steps to prevent human trafficking within their borders and those who are engaged in or tolerate particularly severe violations of religious freedom?
We actually subject all transactions to review by the State Department and follow their guidance in terms of whether it's an allowable country or not. So that policy decision made by the State Department, not by us.
So you would take no position on any reforms that we'd propose? Thanks, Chairman. You yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
Mr. Chairman, in a second I'll yield to you for the answer to a question, but I think there are some things we all agree on. This is a very important issue. We've debated it at length. reasonable and good-spirited people can reach different conclusions, and democracy ought to determine what our policy should be. So, Mr. Chairman, will you be doing everything possible so that this committee or the House is voting on whether to reauthorize the Ex-Im Bank in the next couple of weeks?
Is the gentleman yielding to the chairman?
Yes.
The chair will not make a decision until after this hearing. I will listen to all colleagues. I am not aware of any bill that is supported by a majority of the House, much less a majority of this committee. If I'm made aware of such, I assure you it will influence my thinking. I thank the gentleman for yielding.
We may have a chance to look at bills supported by a majority or perhaps a 60% majority of the United States Senate. And there are many bills that come to this committee that we mark up that are not co-sponsored by a majority of the House or a majority of the members of this committee. I think if this committee has a markup, we will devise a bill that has majority support, perhaps taking into consideration the comments of the gentleman of Pennsylvania that we have restrictions on not allowing Ex-Im Bank to operate in those countries that have horrific records on human trafficking. Also, the gentleman from Pennsylvania focuses on the need to try to get other countries to ratchet down their export promotion authorities. That is a responsibility of the Department of Treasury. Without objection, I'd like to put on the record the last 3 annual reports of the Department of Treasury.
Without objection.
And I'll point out that I don't think they're doing as much as they should. But the next administration hopefully will, and the next administration will have nothing. It's like going to a gunfight without even a knife. Will have nothing in its arsenal if we don't have an export promotion authority. If you go into arms talks working for disarmament and you have already unilaterally disarmed, there's no reason for anybody to listen to you. Accounting, my favorite subject. Mr. Hochberg, with generally accepted accounting principles, you have a profit of $750 million. Is that correct?
Last year was 675 to be precise.
Okay. And up on the board, whenever a Republican is speaking, we have the debt clock. So that debt would be $675 million higher if we had abolished your bank a year ago.
Yes, and furthermore, CBO has actually scored the Ex-Im budget initially at $1 billion for deficit reduction, has cut that about in half due to the uncertainty of the reauthorization.
And that's with reserves for the risk that you're taking of default. Just like any insurance company, any lender can calculate its profit only after determining what is an actuarially sound reserve for bad debts. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, I've heard that there's this thing called I don't know that it's called fair value accounting. I think it's better called fantasy value accounting, that would say that you should determine your profit or loss not based on whether you have a profit or loss, but whether you would have a profit or loss in some artificially constructed fair world. And as you've heard me say before, in a fair world, Jack's Pizzeria would have the same cost of funds as Pizza Hut. Now, if you really know Jack, you would not lend him money. But in a fair world, he might have the same cost of funds, and then he'd have a profitable, or Pizza Hut would have a higher cost of funds. But if Pizza Hut had to pay, when it borrowed money, the risk premium that is appropriate for Jack, they'd be out of business. So in the real world, generally accepted accounting principles, those are the same principles used by all the other lenders in the country. Is that correct? And do you show a profit?
Well, the U.S. government uses FCRA, Federal Credit Reform Act, and by that we put aside reserves, as you mentioned, Congressman, about $5 billion worth of reserves, and the rest goes to the taxpayers. Any change in accounting would actually just increase reserves, and then they would be released to the taxpayer.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McCarthy, I'd love your help just trying to make sure I have my head around some of the mechanics I see here. I'm looking at a report, an audit from September 2012. It's, if you're willing to track with me, page 6. But I'm going to do this, I think it's the second paragraph, but I'm going to do it a little bit backwards. Apparently in 2011, it was determined that because of the way the law is structured, the Ex-Im Bank did not need to report impairment of assets. So I guess 2011, they just stopped the impairment. And it's really important for this conversation. There's a difference between impaired assets and write-offs. Can we at least agree to that? Because last time we had some fussing back and forth where we were sort of mixing the two, and I think quite disingenuously. Ms. McCarthy, has there been any attempt since that 2011 to start to say, here's actually what the impairments are actually on this book?
The bank has some separate reports that it prepares. One of the reports that it prepares is the default rate report, and that's
I'm not asking for default, impairment.
There's a different report that's prepared about impaired assets and a watch list.
Okay, so it does exist, but in the last discussion, the Honorable Mr. Hopberg looked at me as if I was deaf, that no such thing existed. I'm not overstating it. You can go back and see the video. So right now, if, as Mr. Mulvaney was talking about, that new set, would I see that on the impairment report, and would the, was it $500 million? Or the dollar amount, would I see that as now the impairment set aside on that report?
I don't know the timing of it, but I would expect that that would be something that would appear on that report, given the recent developments.
So when, in some of the opening discussion here and opening testimony, I'm hearing this repeated statements about, look how low our default rate is. According to that report, if you know off the top of your head, what is the actual default? And remember, default is defined of, I'm late on a payment, I'm out of compliance in my reps and warrants. I'm trying to do my like for like, my ceteris paribus of here's the rest of the world that insures or does guarantees and this institution. So we have at least an honest discussion going on here.
Right. So as you recognize, default can mean different things. It can mean a payment default.
No, we're impairment. Impairment. Default is they're different things.
Well, let me try to explain. I think I understand what you're getting at, and let me try to explain it from our point of view as the IG. The bank reports what they report as the default rate was called the default rate by the 2012 reauthorization, and Congress provided the formula to how the bank calculates that. They've reported that. They've been transparent about that formula. That formula, as you say, is more of a net loss rate than a default rate. Looking at a default rate as more broadly used, as you say, of things that are potentially impaired but haven't yet generated a loss but could potentially do so in the future would have a different calculation.
But if any other institution out there, when someone's out of compliance in the reps and warrants, there's often a scaling of we need to set aside for this. We heard a little while ago that there's, what was it, $5 billion? Or that's ultimately set aside for losses. Does that scale in accordance with the percentage of the book that's in impairment, like every other institution would be required to? And if so, how come a couple of weeks ago when we had this very discussion, I couldn't get near an answer of such a thing as actually scored and kept?
Well, on the impairment list, and I can go and try to look and answer your question more specifically, some of the impairments are more qualitative in nature than quantitative, so in some ways it's difficult to calculate an actual rate.
No, it's not. No, the industry has been doing this for about a couple centuries. And, I mean, there are industry standards in how you do this. So what you're telling me is our institution here doesn't at least just do what's common practice in the rest of the banking and investment world?
The institution has an impaired asset list and a watch list.
Okay, impaired asset, and then the reserve calculations for it.
The reserve calculation is based on the loss experience historically under FICRA.
Mr. Chairman, one more time, yield back. One day I might get an answer.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me, and I keep hearing this thing about winners and losers, winners and losers. It seems to me that what we're talking about is making the American workers the winners here. Clearly, from my experience, I understand, and I don't understand why, especially my friends and colleagues who are supporters of trade, this seems like a no-brainer. Americans are selling more goods and services abroad than ever before, and every $1 million in U.S. exports supports an average of more than 5,000 jobs here at home. American exports supported more than 11.3 million U.S. jobs in 2013. 95% of the world's customers live outside of the United States, and we need to continue to help American businesses to export more, so we should be all talking about how we can export more overseas. I just give you the benefit of my experience just in my small little state of New York, something like Bruce's in Maine. EXIM has committed over $11 billion in total export value. That includes $7 billion in insured shipments, guarantees or dispersed loans, and an additional $4 billion in approved authorizations. There are 350 New York-based exporters that benefited from EXIM Bank trade facilities last year, of which, and this is very significant to me, 201 were small businesses, and 26, where I know Chairman Hochberg and Vice Chair Felton has been working very hard, were minority businesses, they were minority-owned businesses, giving them the opportunity to export. And these businesses operate in various sectors that are creating jobs here in America. We had exports in food manufacturing, machinery manufacturing, transportation services, computer and electronics, insurance, banking, finance, and the list goes on and on and on. And so we need to be exporting more, not less, and that's what the EXIM Bank does. So let me just ask Chairman Hochberg. First, I believe that, isn't it true that I think that EXIM operates more like in this case, a lender of last resorts in one second, correcting the market failures when private trade finances are unable or unwilling to invest in U.S. exports at competitive rates. So then when that happens, the bank of last resort, EXIM, if you're no longer there to help these companies move, what happens to them?
Well, thank you, Congressman. I've often said that we are Plan B. Plan A is the private sector. Plan C would be China. They'd be more than happy to fill in the gap that's the vacuum that we'd create if we're not there. So I think I was talking yesterday with an exporter in Chattanooga, Tennessee, a company that we're working with. They're going to finance an export to China. He's hired up for this thing. He said, you know, if we're not for EXIM, I probably would not have hired those 20 people, and I'd lay off another 20 people. 40 to 50 people, jobs are at stake on this one single order to China.
And so, it just seems, that's why I'm just baffled that some of my colleagues don't believe we need EXIM Bank. And they say that the private sector can do it all. But when we look at between 2008 and 2009, the private sector trade financing fell by 40%, 40%. And as of today, isn't it true, Mr. Hochberg, that many of these private banks are still not willing to extend export financing without additional guarantees from who? EXIM Bank. And can you also talk about the gaps, our financial crises, when we had one in 2008, but the gaps that the crises left in trade financing and how the EXIM Bank filled that void then and continues to fill that void now?
Well, our authorizations hit an all-time high in 2012. We financed made over $36 billion of financing over $50 billion worth of goods. We're operating at about half that level now, which is a good sign that the financial markets are recovering. The banks are more liquid. They're not liquid in every market. They certainly make it tougher for small businesses, but the good news is that when there was a crisis, we stepped in. We were like the fire truck, my analogy, and now that the fires of the recession are more behind us, we've been less active, which is a good sign that the capital markets, banking markets are recovering.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Throughout this process, I've heard from many of the stakeholders involved. I've heard from the bank, from businesses, and my constituents who are the taxpayers. And some of the biggest complaints I hear is, what about taxpayer liability, and does the bank pick winners and losers? And as we've heard today, Ex-Im Bank financed $27.5 billion in exports in 2014. Now, I personally believe that the bank needs reforms. We don't seem to talk about reforms. We just defend positions. But I have yet to see a set of reforms that fixes the two chief complaints I mentioned before. Mr. Chairman, you know my background is in retail. I'm a small business owner for 44 years, a family business founded in 1939. I am Main Street America. I'm a car dealer. And in my industry, when a car needs to be financed, I often will guarantee the note for the person who I'm selling the car to. In other words, I let the bank know that if for some reason the buyer defaults on his loan, I, as the seller, will be responsible for the balance of the loan. In my business, we call that recourse paper. Now, I'm a deal maker, so I want to help you make a deal today. Chairman Hochberg, why couldn't we do something similar with the bank? Why couldn't we say that any money being loaned out by the bank be subject to similar requirements and guarantees? In other words, the seller guarantees the note to Ex-Im, which gets out the taxpayers of their liability. The taxpayers are gone then, and that reduces that question. Why can't we do that?
Well, Congressman, we work in a very competitive world, and that's simply not a competitive practice. The other 80-plus export credit agents would put U.S. companies at a severe disadvantage to their global competitors. And besides which, our default rate, which we report to Congress every 90 days at less than 1/5 of 1%, it doesn't indicate there's a problem here that needs to be fixed.
I hear what you're saying. The taxpayers, though, the taxpayers are guaranteeing this. We need to get the taxpayers out of this. And I understand competition as good as anybody, okay? So I know you've mentioned that there are points and fees that you charge. But that doesn't come anywhere covering the entire liability of the loan, correct?
We've got about $5 billion in reserves to back up any possible defaults.
But it doesn't cover all the loans.
Well, you never have reserves to cover 100%.
Yes, you would if you go recourse paper. Okay, now, my next question is this, and is it correct that, and you said about the default rate for Ex-Im Bank is actually very small, something less than 1%, correct?
It's running less than 1/5 of 1%.
Okay, then another reason to go recourse paper. So in my head, if the businesses benefiting from Ex-Im Bank have skin in the game, like a lot of us do in the private sector, have skin in the game on the loan, and the default rate is so low, which you've talked about, basically zero, all the more reason for them to guarantee the note. And in fact, as you know, if they guarantee the note, you can give them a better rate and make them more competitive across the world, which you just talked about. So the point I'm trying to make, Mr. Chairman, is that the average taxpayer sees the bank as doing exactly what I said before. And just as with other federal agencies who have been bailed out, the taxpayer wants to know what happens if all the loans go bad. I know the possibility of that might be small, which is good, but again, we said that for agencies like Fannie and Freddie, and guess what? They're bailed out, and the taxpayer pays the money. I don't know if something like this could actually save the bank during this conversation, but by removing the taxpayer from the equation, again, removing the taxpayer from the equation, I think it would go a long way to solving a lot of the problems. So again, why can't you do this? Think about it. It's a solution that nobody seems to be talking about. It fixes the questions that I have, and it fixes the questions that Americans have on way they have to support this. So I would also say in closing, I've heard my colleagues talk about why the private sector has left. How about Dodd-Frank? Maybe thinking about that. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the ranking member. Thank you, gentlemen, for your willingness to come here to help the committee with its work. I tend to look at things from the worker perspective. I was a welder and an iron worker down at the Quincy shipyard in the Boston area, down in Quincy, Massachusetts, for a while, until that shipyard closed down because of foreign competition. Some foreign Ex-Im banks supported shipbuilding in their countries and put us out of business. And I worked at the General Motors plant in Framingham, Massachusetts, and they closed that plant down and a couple of others and moved them over to Mexico. So I tend to see the effects of what other countries are doing. I just had an opportunity to travel to South Korea and also to Japan. And I make it a point of during my travels, and I was in both those countries for several days, I try to look for American products to see how we're doing in Korea, in South Korea, and in Japan. We were in South Korea for several days. It's a major industrialized country, big highways, millions of cars, there for 3 days, stuck in plenty of traffic. I saw 2 U.S. cars out of hundreds of thousands of cars in South Korea. The only 2 cars I saw, the one I was driving in from the U.S. Embassy and the one behind me that had the U.S. Embassy security team for my detail. That was it. I was in Japan, the same thing. Looked, like nobody's business, trying to find a U.S. car. Nothing. So it just bothers me to no end that the Korean Ex-Im Bank and the Japanese Ex-Im banks are picking winners and losers. They're picking winners and losers, and they're picking Korean winners, South Korean winners, and Japanese winners. And we're criticizing our Ex-Im bank because you're picking American winners. And I have a real problem with what's going to happen here once America gets off the field, once we surrender and say, okay, China, you can push Chinese manufacturing, and we're going to tie our hands behind our back. And what will this do? What will this do to creating U.S. jobs? And, I have to say that I hope and understand that your job is to create American jobs. And there's been some criticism here today of the way you're going about it, but I do think it is in the best interest of the American worker to be in the game, to be trying to push American companies. And I've said before, your support for Boeing doesn't support necessarily Massachusetts jobs in my district. But it's okay if you're putting Americans to work in Washington State. God bless you for doing that. And any other American company that you help. I don't think we can be parochial at that level. And can you just tell me what your ideas about what's going to happen if we walk off the playing field and leave it to these foreign export-import banks to drive the creation of manufacturing jobs and other jobs around the world? Mr. Hochberg.
Well, thank you for that. We take very seriously our jobs mandate. We're about U.S. jobs and not really about U.S. companies. When a U.S. company or a company makes goods in America, we support it. As I've said before, 164,000 jobs last year alone. And even when you make the comment about Boeing, I suspect there are many, many Boeing suppliers in the state of Massachusetts. So every time a Boeing plane is delivered to a foreign customer, many small businesses benefit. I was just in Erie, Pennsylvania, a town that without the exports from GE Locomotive would be a very quiet town with not very many good jobs. And I met with a number of the small businesses that actually supply machine parts, tool and die parts that go into the locomotives, go into those engines. One company I met, ISM, 175 employees, a full 15% of their work is tied to GE exports. So they're very much tied to the state of those larger companies making those exports. But I think what we're putting in jeopardy is 164,000 jobs. That's a lot of jobs. That's a lot of families in their homes. That's a lot of families who are relying on these export jobs and the financing we do to make sure that export happens. And again, 90% of those companies are small businesses, some in the Chairman's district itself.
All right, thank you. I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maine, Mr. Poliquin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. I appreciate it. Mr. Hochberg, since 2009, you've run this independent XM Bank. It's an entity that's been created by the federal government here in the 1930s. You have about 450 employees, and you folks provide low interest rate loans to foreign entities that turn around and buy U.S. products from U.S. companies, of course. Now, if these foreign companies cannot repay their loans, then the taxpayers are on the hook. In fact, the reason why you are able to provide foreign companies with cheaper credit than non-government banks is because the taxpayers backstop. So where I want to go down this path, sir, if I may, is I've heard today from you and from other folks here in this hearing room, there's no cost to the taxpayer. There's no free lunch, Mr. Hochberg. Everybody knows that. Of course there's a cost to the taxpayer. For example, if you have a worker at a company and across the street is a competitor roughly the same product, and that company is financed in part by you folks, and so that product is purchased but not the product from the company that the other gentleman works for, then you have picked that winner and he loses. There's a cost to that individual. Second of all, is that the only reason why, again, that a non-government bank isn't able to provide credit to some of these foreign companies is because you folks step in and you're backstopped by the U.S. taxpayer that's on the risk if something goes wrong. And so those U.S. banks who might be able to extend those loans are unable to do so. So there's a cost to those banks, sir, in the non-government sector and also to the people they employ. Now, there's one other cost that I'd like to talk about today that hasn't been discussed, and that's reputational risk for the U.S. government. Now, I understand that you are appointed by the President, and you also serve as the chairman of the board of your own directors. And you've stated here today in testimony that you raise money for the President. I don't see any way, sir, that Congress is able to hold you accountable. We don't appropriate any money to you. Now, what does it say to investors around the world who run companies who are thinking about investing in our economy, whether it be in Maine's 2nd District or throughout the country, that we have an export-import bank where, if my notes are right, and I know Mr. McCarthy, your Inspector General from the inside will correct me if I'm wrong, where over the last 5 years you've had 48 people associated with the bank have been convicted of fraud. You have 37 ongoing investigations for fraud and corruption right now. There have been about 66 years of prison time that's been dished out to these folks over the last 5 years, and about $224 million of fines. Now, there was a bank employee not long ago that accepted $78,000, $80,000 in cash as a bribe to help folks out, foreign companies out, to receive your credit, your cheap credit, and I guess he's going to be sentenced in July. There was a former member of Congress who's in jail in Louisiana right now, and they found $90,000 of cash in his freezer that was associated with lending practices at the bank. So I'm asking myself, Mr. Hochberg, I represent 650,000 of the hardest working, most honest people that you could ever find in this country in Maine's 2nd District. And now you come before us. And the only way we have accountability, or we can hold you accountable, is to determine whether or not we reauthorize your charter. I'd like to find out how I can go back to the people that I represent with this trail of mismanagement, ongoing mismanagement, and vote to reauthorize your bank. Now, I'd like to turn over to your Inspector General that's internally working at your bank. Sir, you're also appointed by the President, is that correct?
The position is appointed by the President, and I'm currently doing
Okay,
it.
do you have subpoena authority?
Yes, we do.
You do. Do you have the ability to make criminal referrals?
We do.
Good. And do you have the ability to investigate employees who are no longer at the bank but have left the bank?
We do.
Good. Do you have enough independence from the gentleman sitting right beside you that you work with under the same roof that you think you can do your work effectively?
Yes, we do. Under the Inspector General Act, we have organizational independence. We also have our own separate appropriation and
Good.
manage our own budget.
Mr. McCarthy, you keep doing your work and you keep digging. If you need any help, you call our office. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Heck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm reminded of a presentation I was a party to while in college. One of the faculty members at my school did some of the seminal field research on the correlation between the presence of DDT and eggshell damage among peregrine falcons. In his presentation to us, he had a scatter graph, and the correlation was between the presence and mortality rates among peregrine falcon eggs. And almost all the dots were concentrated on they died. And there was one or two way up there where they didn't. And when he made that presentation to the manufacturer of DDT, their response was, what about those two? And I feel a little bit like I'm living through that again almost 50 years later. There's a lot of semantics going on here as it relates, for example, to default rates, but the fact is the Export-Import Bank has a default rate and a loss ratio that is the envy of commercial banks. That's the fact. Mr. McCarthy, you're an incredibly patient human being. Thank you so much for being here. I want to make sure I understood you correctly. Is it accurate and fair for me to infer from your remarks, both in opening statement and answers to questions, that your opinion is the Export-Import Bank has made a good faith and reasonable effort to embrace and implement the recommendations you have made?
We've made our recommendations. The bank has to implement them. We've closed a number of those recommendations, and we continue to make progress on them.
Thank you. Mr. Hochberg, I want to get at the issue of harm. At its essence, some of this has to do with those who advocate that there will be no harm done if the Export-Import Bank's charter expires. I happen to share the concerns and worries of Speaker Boehner, who said he believes there will be lots of job loss if that happens. I'm beginning to believe that the opponents are beginning to worry about that as well, insofar as they're wish casting, my new favorite word, that the private sector will step in. Let's break that down. First, for small businesses, I think often overlooked is the fact that a preponderance of the transactions aren't direct loans, but loan guarantees, revolving lines of credit, and what I call accounts receivable insurance. I think of Pexco in my district, manufactures traffic cones, little tiny quantities, sold to Belgium, or Manhasset music stands, one of the largest music stands in America, in Yakima, Washington. Is there any evidence to suggest that there's any place within the commercial sector where a bank would step in and guarantee such small amounts of exports, even though those exports, for example, in Manhasset's case, I believe constitute over 30% of its business? Is there any evidence to that effect, Mr. Hochberg?
Congressman Heck, the reason we are brought in, and a bank brings us in, as I said generally, or a broker, is because they can't do it on their own, or they refuse to, because it goes beyond their credit standards, beyond their risk profile.
So then let's scale up and deal with the large business part. Obviously, the name of the manufacturer of the finest airplane on the face of the planet has been invoked many times here. I just want to remind everybody that they assemble planes. They don't manufacture them. Their supply chain is 15,000 businesses, 6,000 to 8,000 of which are small businesses. They make the parts. I've always thought that the way the Boeing company would deal with this is that they would provision for it if the XM goes away on their balance sheet. Now, I come from the private sector, and I think anybody who does understands what that means. That means there'll be a lot less money available to invest in attracting and retaining a quality workforce, research and development, remembering that the manufacturing of commercial airplanes is an exceedingly competitive business now between Boeing and Airbus, but soon to be China, and that they would therefore be harmed by it. But here's my question, Mr. Hochberg. That's how I thought this would play out, and that it would cause the loss of jobs. But I've recently read that I think the chairman and the CEO of the company had indicated that if we unilaterally disarm, that the company would be compelled to consider moving offshore certain parts of their manufacturing production. Do you find that to be a plausible response to our shutting of your bank? And if so, what would the damage be to the manufacturing sector in America?
Sorry, without question, that's a very real possibility, and certainly with the company mentioned, Boeing, but many others, GE, that have facilities all over the world could very easily begin to offshore their work permanently.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, Vice Chairman of the committee.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. I know it's been a long day. But Mr. Hochberg, I think what members, policymakers want to know here with reauthorization coming at the end of the month is some sort of basic admission that there are some challenges in running an organization, right? There have been discussions of indictments. The IG is sitting next to you. There are ongoing investigations there. So what would you say?
Well, I should probably let the IG answer himself, but we've had one
I'm asking you.
We've had one indictment, sir, one indictment, and the person pled guilty, and that came to light because another employee saw something that didn't look proper. And the other investigations, the Inspector General has said, at this point in the investigation, none of them involve employees. But you can ask him directly.
Okay. So are there any management challenges?
Sir, I've run a company for 20 years. Every organization has management challenges.
So this is no different? This is no different?
Every organization is different, but of course there are management challenges. We're trying to move forward. We're trying to be responsive to Congress, responsive to exporters, work with the private sector and not compete with the private sector, make sure we're competitive globally. There are a number of those challenges. Get more small businesses to export.
So, government survey of your employees at XM, government employees, not your employees. You had the organization, but they don't work for you. They work for the American taxpayer. Only 42% of XM, Export-Import Bank employees agree with the statement, my organization's leaders maintain high standards of honesty and integrity. Is that sufficient?
Pardon me. 42% said that, and about 30% had no opinion.
So that's fantastic, is what you're telling me?
No, I'd like to do better.
As a policymaker, I'm supposed to look at this and say, keep going, man. You're doing fantastic.
Without question, sir, I take this very seriously. We all take this seriously at the bank. And we put a much higher priority on improving the workplace environment we have at Exim Bank. Of course, I'm disappointed in those results.
Okay, some sort of admission is sort of helpful. I'm not trying to inject humility to a grown man here, but I'm simply saying that that should not be in any way acceptable. And there should be a firm desire to improve the standards you have within the organization that you head. Giving the opportunity to say that is what I'm telling you.
Yes, one of the key objectives we established.
Just because you say, you know, we've only had one indictment, how is that a sales pitch for reauthorization of the organization you head up, that you explain in great detail the importance of what you do? And your defense is one indictment? We've only had one indictment? I mean, hell, the American people look at Congress and don't say, well, gosh, they've only had one indictment. Wow, that's good. We're happy. Walk me through this.
I'd be happy to, sir. Some have asserted in this committee that the organization is full of corruption. What I tried to indicate, there's one indictment, one employee. The other investigations involved outside entities, companies and individuals trying to defraud the government. That's what I was referring to. In terms of improving the workplace environment, last fall we established 4 objectives for the bank, and amongst the top 4 was making this a first-tier place to work, improving management development, improving opportunities, making this a better place to work.
So
and we're working hard at that.
So in the same survey, you have half of your employees agree, or that half the employees at the organization you had agree that if they disclose suspected violations of any law, rule, or regulation, they will not fear. Actually, only half say that they would not fear reprisal for that.
Well, if you look at the data, sir, only 20% actually disagreed with that statement. Not 20% of the employees said they actually did not feel comfortable.
This is like saying, I'm like bragging, I'm firmly middle management. I'm a solid C student. Like this sort of, you should be making a better effort on this to acknowledge that yes, there are failures. That would be a helpful thing, I would think. I'm not trying to change your sales pitch, but I'm just telling you, it ain't working, man. It's just not working. We're not buying it when you say that the management practices are sufficient good, and just because you've raised this as a higher priority, that's sufficient. We should be happy as policymakers when we look at your charter. Right? Something's got to change.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Beatty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member, and thank you to our witnesses today. First, let me say to you, Mr. Huckberg, welcome back to our committee. And I certainly want to take this opportunity of personal privilege to thank you for coming to my district. When you heard the concerns, and not just coming to give a speech or be there for an hour, but to stay there and walk through the district and hear from a panel of some 50 folks. And also, it was my pleasure to have you visit with a small company, Davenport Aviation, you'll probably remember, that utilizes XM resources to finance exports of its aircraft products internationally. Well, today has been interesting, disappointing. It's been about a whole lot of issues for me, from where you slept, what room you slept in, how much money you took, to this whole concept of winners and losers. Well, I believe this Congress should work to lift up America. And we should work day and night to support small businesses, to help our veterans, to invest in innovation. But clearly, some of my colleagues on the other side want to pick winners and let the rest of America suffer as losers. Well, if we're going to have that theme, since all morning we've been hearing about winners and losers, and Democrats have even been accused of flipping our opposition on the Exim Bank. Well, I'm not going to take time, and I'm going to follow Mr. Capuano and not read off the list of people who have switched their votes on both sides. But I would like to draw this committee's attention to some of the losers under the current Republican leadership. Last Congress, if the majority had their way, the SNAP program, known as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, the food stamp program, would have suffered over $20.5 billion in cuts. That's $1 billion. These cuts would have cost millions of our most at-risk Americans, seniors, children, and veterans to go hungry. And later today, the House will vote on another appropriation bill, subject to the drastic spending caps created under the sequester. Under the Commerce, Justice, Science appropriation bill, funding for the Legal Service Corporation is cut by $75 million, reducing it to just $300 million. And thousands of people who qualify for legal representation from LSC and who will be turned away. Well, that's just another example of losers. So I get confused when sometimes we're accused of supporting the big folks. Well, in this case, we supported a lot of folks, and we made the losers the small people. So I'm glad that I went to my district and I started asking the small companies what they thought. And so here is the statement. The XM is 100% necessary for my company, the president of Davenport Aviation said. My company, without XM Bank, would not be able to exist. One of my Central Ohio Republican colleagues said that he had heard from employers in Central Ohio and how they directly benefited from the XM Bank and the consequences of not reauthorizing it. So my point is, as we look to this, you've been criticized, you've both been asked a lot of questions about the small business. So critics of the XM exclaimed that the bank promotes production in one sector of the economy to the detriment of the other. And we've heard all those critics. And that the XM picks winners and losers. So can you highlight this notion of XM picking winners and losers and how the bank actually extends loans and guarantees to all applicants that meets its strict lending requirements?
Thank you, Congresswoman. It was very good to be out in your district together. As I said in my testimony, I'll be brief because we do not pick winners and losers. Companies come to us when they can't secure the financing they need to make that export sale and support jobs. That's what comes to us. And there was a comment in Maine, if there are two companies, if one doesn't need our support and the other one does, if one can find it in the private sector, we're delighted with that. But we want to make sure it's a level playing field and that finance is this thing that gets in the way. We don't want that to stop creating jobs in America versus jobs overseas.
Thank you. And I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Luca Meyer, chairman of our Housing and Insurance Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's interesting. I had a meeting the other day with the CEO of a large company that buys a lot of large items like airplanes, train cars, heavy equipment. And I asked him the question, if XM went away, what would you do? And his first response was, first thing I'll do is I quit buying Boeing planes, I'm going to go buy Airbuses. All the jobs go away. You know, Boeing isn't a manufacturing company. They're a design and assembly company. They've got 1,800 little manufacturers, small businesses that produce their parts. So there's 1,800 small manufacturers that are relying on this bank to be able to exist, to be able to make a profit, to hire people. I think your numbers, Mr. Hochberg, indicated a minute ago, 160,000 plus was created recently, the last year or so. You know, it's interesting also, I sit on the Small Business Committee as well, I'm vice chairman of the committee, and we've had a couple of hearings. And in those hearings, we've had, you know, obviously all small business people all the time talk about their concerns, whether it's taxes, regulation, whatever. And discussion eventually gets around to XM Bank. If it doesn't, I get there with it. And I ask them if, what's your opinion of it? And every single one, not one time in the committee hearings that we've had, has there been one person said we don't need it. Every single one says we need it, it's important, we have to compete. So I guess my first question to you, sir, would be, do you have any idea of all the other suppliers that are affected by, I think the number of small businesses that you loan to directly is like 3,400, but an instance, if you have Boeing with 1,800, how many other small businesses do you have it calculated that are affected by your bank?
It's hard to get a precise number of the small business in the supply chain, but as you mentioned, I visited a company called LMI that's a Boeing supplier in Missouri. This is a company called Tomco that supplies GE with fire suppression that's used in their power plants they export overseas. So over and over again, the company that Congressman Beatty referred to sells replacement parts for Boeing aircraft overseas to airlines in sub-Saharan Africa. So there are many small businesses, both direct and indirect. The indirect are, like in a campaign, who provides the catering and the yard signs and the printing. Those are indirect beneficiaries. They may not. And in the same way, Boeing has 15,000 suppliers. I understand about 6,000 are small businesses.
What is the percentage of small businesses that access your bank as it is now versus the big guys? In other words, out of
90% of our customers, direct beneficiaries, are small businesses, and that we finance of the export to the $27 billion we financed, about 39%, about $10 billion were from those small companies. And that doesn't even count all the indirects, as you referenced.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. I also have a lady in my district that produces, she builds log homes out of oak logs. I come from central Missouri. Oak logs are very plentiful, and that's what she does. She also takes those oak logs and packages them into a kit and sells them to China, and your bank helps finance that. I thank you for that. If you go away, she goes away. And I think that those jobs are going to go away with it. You know, one of the arguments that seems to be out there that these jobs will all find someplace else to go. I think my first example was, no, they're not. They're going to go to France to buy Airbuses. They will not be created at all because that lady will no longer be able to finance the kits she sells to China. And it's interesting that my side is interested in dynamic scoring. So that if you have a job and you do something that the exponential economic increase off that is something I would think they'd be very interested in and would really score, this bill would really score well from the standpoint of the job creation that's out there. So I think it's a point that needs to be made, and I think that, excuse me, I understand that sometimes there's, I know our Vice Chairman was making some reference to some of the internal problems that you have in the bank, and we can't deny that. But I think that if we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater, you never go out and you don't throw away the whole police department if there's problems within the police department. You clean it up. You make it better. I think that's the responsibility of Congress. For us to disregard that responsibility and just say, no, we don't need the bank, is disregarding our responsibility. It's also interesting to me that I've heard the words level playing field for our companies, creating jobs, must be able to compete with China. If we don't, they're going to fill the void, which sounds like some of the rhetoric that I use when I try to defend Ex-Im Bank, yet that's the same rhetoric that my colleagues use to support the TPA and going with the trade agreement and the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement. So, and yet they're going to vote against versus for, and I really fail to see the situation here. But I see I'm over my time, and I appreciate the opportunity to voice a few concerns, and I yield back to the chairman.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Tipton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hochberg, Mr. McCarthy, thank you for taking time to be able to be here. Mr. Hochberg, I think I'd like to follow up a little bit along the lines of Mr. Williams' questioning in regards to the need for Ex-Im Bank, given that we have the private sector. Can you name for me a bank in the country if we have a default rate of 0.167%, a bank that would not take a loan?
One of the reasons we have a default rate of 0.167% is twofold. One is our underwriting, but most importantly, that it's backed by the full faith of the U.S. government. People don't default on the U.S. government. That's a very strong incentive for people to pay and to make sure we have a good credit rating.
So no private sector banks can fill this?
Private sector banks are those who bring us to the transaction. That's the only reason we're there. We don't muscle them out. They actually bring us in because the example I gave earlier of a company in Detroit where the fact is their bank said, unless Ex-Im guarantees the loan, we will not do it. When I spoke yesterday to a company in Tennessee.
And that's because regulatorily they can't make the loan. Is that correct?
Either it's outside of their strike zone, it's outside of their risk profile.
But the risk profile is going to be driven by the regulations that come out of the federal government.
Part of it's also come through Basel III, sir, where banks have severe penalties for lending more than 5 or 6.
So we're getting the FSB, the FSOC that's going to be involved. Bottom line is we're getting back to regulations which are coming out of FSB or FSOC that are coming in telling banks what those profiles can actually be. So we're squeezing out the private sector, leaving you as the sole source of capital.
Well, sir, we did, as I mentioned last year, about $20 billion worth of loans. The private sector did a spectacular job. We only came into those few situations. Right now,
I understand that, sir, but I guess the point I'm trying to be able to get at is that we've got to be able to have the government backstop on this. Can it be filled by the private sector? And what I'm asking you is this really regulatory in nature coming out of policies, be it the FSB, the FSOC, out of Dodd-Frank, and the implications that are coming in that are going to be inhibiting the private sector from being able to participate in this?
I only can tell you would have to ask a commercial banker that question. I only can tell you that we are brought in when the bank said we cannot.
You know, ironically, I have asked banks that, and may not be in Ex-Im's particular portfolio, loans that they'd like to be able to make, but because of regulations they cannot make. And this is an opportunity actually for the private sector to be able to step in and to be able to service that need and maybe to be able to create actually more jobs. Do you think this is actually maybe your very existence is an indictment of, and we all know there need to be some regulations, but over-regulation that is literally coming out of expansive government policy that's being now collaborative with our European counterparts?
Exim Bank today, and I look at our foreign counterparts, we exist when there's crises in the financial markets globally. That's why we did so much loans 2 years ago, because of a severe contraction of credit globally in the aftermath of the worst recession since the 1930s depression.
Exactly, and we could have probably a great argument on who helped precipitate that crisis in terms of government policy that was being put forward. But if we look at really the regulations, and if we're talking about being able to be competitive, right now we are seeing businesses in this country paying $2 trillion in regulatory costs. We see the lowest labor participation rate. We've got a broken tax code. Just visited with a company that has a 32% effective tax rate. What if we were to shift that policy to be able to make the United States a place where people want to be able to come and do business, to where it's easier to be able to get a loan, where we put the risk not on the federal government, not ultimately on the American taxpayer, but back into the private sector where it actually should belong? Would you dispute that that's a bad idea?
We have the best private sector in the world. We have the best private banking system in the world, and it's the most expansive. It's just not 100%. We try and fill in the gap when it can fill in certain gaps based on economic conditions or certain countries or industries at a certain time. The nuclear industry is a good example. That's very hard to get private sector financing no matter what you do to the regulations, and we fill in that market.
Well, again, I think we could probably have a discussion over whether or not the private sector wouldn't do it. As long as there's going to be the government backstop, there is no incentive for the private sector to be able to step in. The risk can actually be taken through that private sector. And, Mr. Chairman, my time should be over.
Time of the gentleman is yield back. For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition?
Unanimous consent to enter documents into the record. The Bankers Association for Finance and Trade and Financial Services Roundtable, and 1,053 organizations from across the country that are urging support for long-term reauthorization.
Without objection. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Emmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member, and thank you, Mr. Hochberg and Mr. McCarthy, for being here. I'm relatively new to this committee, and I'm working to get up to speed quickly. Again, I appreciate you being here today and answering these questions. It's been very informative for me. Now, Mr. Hochberg, in your opening statement, you reminded us that XM was created to support American jobs. And I believe the mission statement for XM provides specifically that it is to contribute to maintaining or increasing employment of U.S. workers by subsidizing the export of U.S. goods and services to foreign markets. Further, it's my understanding that the XM Bank is primarily a bank that is, it works for a few large multinational corporations. In fact, according to some of the information that I've recently been going through, I think it was 2013, 75% of the loans, guarantees, and insurance issued through XM were to 10 large companies. That number remained pretty much the same last year in 2014. I hear all the time that it's important for small businesses to have the XM Bank. And I actually have some constituents who have used the XM Bank. The mandate is 20%. I'm interested to know, if you can do it briefly, how do you define a small business?
Small businesses are actually defined by the Small Business Administration. We don't make our own definition. We use the SBA's definition.
What's your understanding of the definition?
Well, it's basically, it depends on the industry. If you're a manufacturer, it's less than 500 employees, but it actually varies industry by a small car dealer is different.
If you're a manufacturer, it's less than 500.
Yes, but it varies, as I say, industry to industry.
All right. I believe I'm correct, and please correct me if I'm wrong. The Ex-Im Bank provides less than 2% of the loans, guarantees, and insurance, in other words, the financing for American exports.
About 2% of U.S. exports, that's correct.
And again, 75% of that goes to large businesses, correct?
The data I gave you, I said earlier, of the $27 billion we financed last year, 39% was shipped directly from small companies, direct exports.
Yeah, I have Mercatus just put out the one for 2014, and it had 76% go to the top 10 largest companies. I'm going to move on from that because time is limited. You have focused on how other countries are aggressively supporting their commercial sectors as a means to enhance their sphere of influence. And you've used China as the example, and the ranking member this morning talked about China. In fact, I think you said at one point in the near future they will double the financing for their exports. And yet, according to some information that I have, your bank last year guaranteed, I think it was $18 million for a deal with the Chinese Ex-Im Bank was doing. Why is the Ex-Im Bank in this country helping to guarantee this wonderfully successful and aggressive Chinese Ex-Im Bank?
We do a number of transactions with China. A lot of them are small. The company I mentioned earlier, Tuftco in Chattanooga, Tennessee, the debt is guaranteed by the China Ex-Im Bank. So instead of working to the buyer in China, we actually have a government guarantee.
Mr. Hochberg, let me put it this way. If they're so successful and they're so aggressive, it doesn't seem to make sense that you are guaranteeing their deals. They should be able to do it on their own. I will also ask you this. Apparently last year, before they ran into sanctions, your bank was actively working with a Russian bank that's doing business with Russia's arms dealers. And you didn't stop that until the sanctions were put in place. All I would suggest is, in my initial review of this, it looks like we're not staying in accordance with our mission. And Mr. Chair, I'd yield my last 30 seconds to the Chair.
I thank the gentleman. Chairman Hochberg, you've heard several members speak of this NewSat scandal today. We are under the impression that you, the Ex-Im, have in your possession the report by consultant Brendan Rudd, I believe his name is pronounced. Our staff has asked your staff for a copy of this. It is my understanding that your staff has refused. Will you provide the Rudd report on NewSat to the committee?
Mr. Chairman, there's not a report. It's an email we received from Mr. Rudd that outlines a number of allegations that we're working with the legal authorities to run them down to find out what's true and what's not true, so we don't have a lot of
but sir, will you provide a copy of this to the committee?
Right now, it's still business confidential. We would like to keep this so we can actually move forward. I'm trying to find a way we get to a good answer and a good outcome for the American taxpayers and for Ex-Im Bank.
The committee has requested this. We will put an official request. I hope we don't have to subpoena it. We would hope that you would voluntarily supply this. Time of the gentleman has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Fincher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Hochberg and Mr. McCarthy, for being here today. A lot has been said today, many comments, both sides of the aisle, pro and con. I was just thinking, I was looking over some notes about one of our greatest presidents, President Reagan, and how he was able to guide the country in the direction of prosperity and growth, was able to make things work, and how I was thinking about a lot of the policies that he championed, and how I wonder in today's political world, on the Republican side of the aisle, how many of my colleagues would politically go after President Reagan because he wasn't, in their mind, conservative enough, which is really ridiculous because he was able to do a lot for this country with his leadership. Also today, as I've been listening to a lot of the comments, I guess I've got to get on my staff. I thought we had introduced a bill with 60 co-sponsors earlier in the year, H.R. 597, to reauthorize and reform the Ex-Im Bank. So many of the issues that have been brought up today, we are addressing in our reform package. I was just looking over some of the things, making the Office of Ethics statutory. To my good friend Mr. Williams from Texas, we allow the bank to build its own earnings now. So if there's ever a place and time that there is a failure, we allow the bank to build its own capital so the taxpayer will not be on the hook. We are actually strengthening and making this, as you know, what is frustrating as a good conservative Republican is we are sent to Washington to make the government more accountable, more transparent, more responsible, and work for our constituents. You know, last night I have a lot of thoughts run through my head now, and I asked my wife, I said, you know, am I sure I'm doing what's right? And she said, you know in your heart you're doing what's right. And I said, well, it's very difficult on me having a disagreement with the chairman. And she says, well, honey, and she's been wrong before, but I think she was right this time. She said, you don't work for the chairman. You don't work for the president. You don't work for the speaker. You work for your district. You work for the hard-working Americans all over this country, and you're sent to Washington to do the best you can with what you've got. Now look, the easiest thing for us to do here politically is to blow this thing up and go back home to our districts and blame everybody else for it. And you know who's going to be left holding the bag? The workers that lose their jobs because these companies are buying products from people in other places around the world. Now, we have a challenge here. Are we going to step up and try to do the right thing? Roger Williams brought up a great point when it came to reforming this part of the non-recourse loan. Do you know how we do that? We do that in bringing something before this committee in regular order. Chairman Hensarling has been a champion of regular order. Allow us to have our day, allow us to have our say, and if the opponents of this win out, then we lose and the bank won't be reauthorized. But we have all of these reforms. We've been working on a conservative approach to fixing the problems with this bank. But yet we somehow can't seem to come together and at least have an open and honest debate. You know, the hearings are good. I know they serve their purpose. But this is getting a little old, doing the same thing over and over and over. When we could have a markup, we could have regular order. The people could offer amendments if they wanted to end the bank, amendments to have non-recourse, whatever amendment they wanted to offer. And we could all vote, we could all have our say, we could all show people where we stand on these issues. Or we can continue to play the game. It expires in, 14 days? We have an obligation to do what's right for the American people. And I have an obligation to work for my district. 160,000 jobs nationwide, 8,300 jobs in the state of Tennessee, 116 exporting companies in the state of Tennessee. The American people deserve better, and we need to give it to them. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Hampshire, Mr. Ginta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Hochberg, for being here today to talk about this issue. I've listened to a lot of the testimony and a lot of the questions, and I think this is a very serious and complex issue before this committee and before Congress. I served back in the 112th Congress when this was reauthorized, and I've met with you and I've listened to your testimony, I've read your testimony, and I've tried to look at this in a way that gives me as much information as I can possibly have as I try to make a decision. I've met with companies back home who favor and support reauthorization. I've talked to constituents who oppose reauthorization for different reasons. One of the things, there's two areas that I think I'd like to focus on that I need some clarification on. You stated in your testimony this morning, I think in your written testimony, very basic statement. To be clear, every action and study required in the bank's 2012 bipartisan reauthorization has been completed and implemented or is being compiled with on an ongoing basis. And you have the attachment to identify that. What what I'd like you to walk me through, as I looked through all of these recommendations, I see a number of them that are fully implemented, but I see quite a few that say concur, working to implement. Concur, comma, working to implement. And a number of them go back to 2010, 2012, 2013. So I wonder if you could clarify for me why it would be taking so long to implement some of these recommendations. And I can be specific on some of them, but if you just want to answer generally or broadly, and then I can get more specific.
Well, for example, from the Inspector General, there are ongoing studies, ongoing audits, ongoing proposals for improvement. They're currently standing at 145. We have closed out 97 of them. 2/3 of them are closed out. Since we last had a hearing here 6 weeks ago, we've closed out another 10, 9 or 10 of them in that period. So we're continually working through that. So we've agreed with the Inspector General on 143 out of 145 recommendations. So once we agree, then the next work is to do a work plan together to actually implement that. That's what we're working on.
What about in the area of portfolio risk and loss reserve allocation policy? Under recommendation 5, it says create the position of Chief Risk Officer to oversee the design and implementation of an agency-wide risk management. And it says concur, working to implement. Is that accurate?
I added a Chief Risk Officer, C.J. Hall. He joined the bank in the fall of 2013.
So are there reports from C.J. that...
C.J. Hall, he chairs the Enterprise Risk Committee. It is then there are two people under him, two long-serving career employees who are actually the two sort of deputies on that committee that meet on a regular basis, review the portfolio, review credit policy, when appropriate, make recommendations to me or the board if it requires board approval, but works closely on providing an enterprise-wide review of all risk whatsoever. That was one of the that was an early recommendation before the 2012 reauthorization that we implemented voluntarily.
So are there reports that CJ creates that Congress should be looking at or can look at?
Well, one of the things they approve is the default report, which comes to Congress every 90 days.
How about other reports?
There are other reports. Some of them they send to the audit committee of the bank. Some come to me. Some will go to the Inspector General. I could probably let the Inspector General answer the rest of that question.
What about, there's another one from September 28, 2012, Export-Import Bank Short-Term Insurance Program. It's recommendation 6, develop and implement a monitoring process for periodically reviewing a sample of authorizations. It says concur, working to implement. Is that not completed?
I would be probably better served by having Mike McCarthy respond directly.
Which one were you referring to?
Recommendation 6 from September 28, 2012, under Export-Import Bank Short-Term Insurance Program. I mean, it's recommendation 6 and 7, both say concur, working to implement. I guess my question is, if that's accurate, if you're working to implement, why would it take from September 2012 to today to not complete?
I think our view overall is that we've been working with the bank to implement these recommendations. We've drawn a distinction, and I did in my testimony today, between current recommendations that have been issued in this fiscal year and older ones. The older ones we would like to see more progress on.
Okay. Thank you.
The time of the gentleman has expired. There are no other members in the queue, so we will excuse our first panel. Mr. McCarthy, Chairman Hochberg, thank you very much for your testimony. The Chair wishes to alert all members there are currently votes taking place on the floor. Thus, we will not at this time convene the second panel, but we will excuse the first panel. We expect to be on the floor for quite some time. We anticipate convening the second panel in approximately an hour and a half. Until then, the committee stands in recess.